They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle where American pilots cut down the pride of Japan's Air Force in a single, decisive clash. It was June 1944, and the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the blazing summer sun. The war had shifted. No longer was Japan on the offensive, sweeping across Asia with unstoppable fury. Instead, the once mighty Imperial Navy was being hunted. At stake was nothing less than the survival of Japan's ability to wage war. And in those vast waters, across the skies above the Marianas, the largest carrier battle in history was about to erupt. The Americans came prepared with overwhelming power, fast carriers bristling with aircraft, radar-guided defenses, and fleets of submarines waiting below the waves. Facing them were Japan's finest aviators, or what remained of them. Many undertrained rushed into service, and flying against odds that could no longer be overcome. When the clash came, it wasn't just a battle for islands, it was the breaking point for Japan's naval air force. The fighting raged across thousands of miles of ocean. Carrier decks roared with the thunder of engines as squadrons launched into the sky. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracer shells streaking through the blue as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft hurtled into the storm. American pilots, many veterans hardened by years of combat, met them head-on. What followed would be remembered not as an even contest, but as a massacre. For Japan, this was the desperate gamble, an attempt to halt the American advance before it reached the heart of the empire. For the United States, it was the moment when new technology, superior training, and overwhelming production collided to crush an enemy that had once seemed unstoppable. By the end, the seas would be littered with wreckage, and the skies would fall silent, emptied of Japan's last great hope. This is not just the story of ships and planes, it is the story of courage, sacrifice, and the brutal arithmetic of war. It is the story of how the tide of the Pacific turned once and for all, ensuring that Japan's empire would never rise again. So, settle in. Whether you're watching from New York, Sydney, Manila, or London, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. And let's travel back together to June 1944 to witness the skies above the Philippine Sea ignite in fire and fury. By early 1944, the Pacific Ocean was a vast battlefield, stretching thousands of miles from the jungles of New Guinea to the volcanic islands that guarded Japan itself. The tides of war, which had once seemed to flow in Japan's favor, had begun to turn decisively toward the Allies. American forces, backed by the full industrial might of the United States, pushed relentlessly across island chains, reducing once proud Japanese garrisons to rubble. Naval task forces, led by carriers that bristled with aircraft, now roamed the Pacific with an authority the Imperial Navy could no longer match. The Japanese perimeter, once stretched boldly across the Central and South Pacific, was shrinking under constant pressure. Battles fought in the Solomons, at Tarawa, and in the Marshall Islands revealed both the determination of American troops and the growing weakness of Japanese defenses. The Pacific had become a cauldron of destruction, where every atoll and lagoon carried strategic weight. At the heart of this struggle lay the question of who would control the seas and skies. For Japan, the answer was slipping from their grasp. For the United States, victory seemed ever closer, though bought with terrible cost. The Marianas Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, emerged as the next crucial objective in the Allied advance. These islands, positioned like stepping stones across the Central Pacific, offered airfields within striking range of the Japanese home islands. Capturing them would allow the United States to deploy the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, capable of carrying destruction to Tokyo, Osaka, and beyond. For Japan, the defense of the Marianas was not just about territory, it was about survival itself. If the Marianas fell, the war would shift irreversibly in America's favor, bringing the flames of destruction directly to Japan's doorstep. The Imperial Navy understood this, and so did the Americans. The seas around the Marianas would become the arena for a clash unlike any before, a confrontation of carriers, pilots, submarines, and battleships, on a scale the world had never seen. It was a battle of geography as much as firepower, where the control of islands dictated the fate of nations. In these islands, the Pacific War reached a turning point. Their importance elevated them from obscure dots on the map to the fulcrum of world history. Japan's defensive perimeter, carefully constructed after the initial triumphs of 1941 and 1942, was now fractured and vulnerable. The empire had once boasted control of vast stretches of ocean, fortified with strongholds from Rabaul to Truk, and from the Philippines to the Gilberts. But each battle waged in 1943 and early 1944 gnawed at its edges, tearing away positions the Japanese had once considered impregnable. The Americans, wielding overwhelming industrial superiority, replaced losses quickly, launching new carriers, planes, and submarines into the fray. Japan, by contrast, could not replace what it lost. Its pilots, ships, and fuel dwindled with every passing month. The carefully constructed perimeter was shrinking back toward the heart of the empire, a noose tightening with each American victory. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the Marianas, where the Japanese line of defense faced its greatest test. The once expansive empire was on the defensive, retreating toward its homeland. The shrinking perimeter reflected not just military defeat, but the fading dream of Japanese dominance in Asia. Each retreat marked the crumbling of an empire built on conquest. For the Americans, the path to the Marianas was paved with fire and blood. The Gilbert Islands campaign at Tarawa in late 1943 had taught harsh lessons about amphibious warfare, showing how costly even a tiny island could be when defended to the last man. The Marshall's campaign in early 1944 demonstrated those lessons learned, as the US bypassed heavily defended outposts and struck directly at key strongholds like Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Each operation brought the US Navy closer to the Marianas, sharpening its logistical mastery and amphibious techniques. The carriers of Task Force 58, now the most powerful naval striking arm in history, had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. With radar, superior aircraft, and well-trained pilots, the Americans dominated the skies. Battleships and cruisers, once sidelined by carriers, provided heavy bombardment, pulverizing Japanese positions before Marines landed. The advance was systematic, unrelenting, and supported by a war industry that dwarfed Japan's. By 1944, the United States had learned how to wage total war in the Pacific. The Marianas represented the next, and perhaps most decisive, step in that campaign. The Japanese High Command understood the stakes with crystal clarity. They knew that losing the Marianas would sever communication lines with Southeast Asia, where vital oil and resources flowed from the Dutch East Indies. It would also open the door for direct American bombing raids on the homeland. To prevent such a catastrophe, Japan prepared Operation Ago, a desperate gamble to bring its remaining carrier strength into decisive battle. The idea was simple in theory. Lure the American fleet into range of both Japanese carriers and land-based aircraft, then deliver a crushing blow that would restore the balance of power. But the plan rested on shaky foundations. Japan's once elite naval aviators had been decimated at Midway, in the Solomons, and at Rabaul. Replacement pilots were poorly trained, rushed into combat with minimal experience. Fuel shortages and strained logistics further weakened Japan's ability to sustain operations. Yet despite these realities, Tokyo believed a decisive battle could change the war. Soberingly, it was a gamble born less of strength than of desperation. While Japan prepared to gamble its fleet, the United States pressed forward with confidence born of overwhelming resources. American industry produced ships, planes, and weapons at a pace that astonished the world. In 1944 alone, the US launched multiple Essex-class carriers, each capable of carrying 90 aircraft, alongside battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Submarines prowled Japanese supply lines, strangling the flow of oil and raw materials. The US Navy had not only rebuilt after Pearl Harbor, it had surpassed its pre-war strength by orders of magnitude. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, represented this new power: 15 carriers, 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers, and nearly 400 planes. Technology gave the Americans an edge too, with radar enabling early detection of incoming attacks and coordination of air defenses. Training programs ensured that US pilots were disciplined, skilled, and combat-ready. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. Against such might, Japan faced a storm it could not hope to equal. The Pacific in early 1944 was not just a contest of fleets, but a clash of strategies and worldviews. Japan's reliance on the decisive battle doctrine, born from centuries of samurai ethos and reinforced by earlier victories, stood in stark contrast to America's attritional strategy. The United States sought to grind down Japan's defenses, island by island, until the path to the homeland lay open. Superior logistics, industrial power, and training formed the bedrock of this approach. Japan, by contrast, clung to the hope that one great battle could overturn years of losses. It was a strategy that ignored the realities of modern warfare, where industrial capacity and technology often outweighed bravery and tradition. As the two fleets prepared for confrontation, their differences could not have been starker. The Americans marched forward with methodical confidence, while Japan prepared for a final roll of the dice. In the Marianas, these clashing strategies would meet head-on. The result would decide the fate of the Pacific. By June 1944, the Pacific was indeed in flames, with battles raging from New Guinea to the Central Pacific. The skies were filled with the roar of engines, the seas churned by the wakes of fleets, and islands scarred by bombardments. Both sides knew that the coming clash in the Philippine Sea would not be just another battle, it would be decisive. For Japan, it was a last desperate attempt to halt the American advance. For the United States, it was a chance to break the back of Japan's naval air power once and for all. The stage was set with clarity and inevitability, like two great storms rushing toward collision. The Marianas stood at the center, their volcanic ridges and sandy beaches destined to become hallowed ground. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen on both sides braced themselves for a battle they sensed would change history. The Pacific had become the world's largest battlefield, and its future would soon be decided in fire and steel. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to begin. By the summer of 1944, the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self, crippled by years of relentless attrition. The stunning defeat at Midway in June 1942 had been the beginning of a downward spiral, robbing Japan of 4 frontline carriers and many of its most experienced pilots. In the Solomons campaign that followed, the Navy had been bled white, losing ships, aircraft, and men in grinding battles that drained irreplaceable resources. The Tokyo High Command had promised the people that the Empire's Navy would protect its vast holdings, yet island after island fell. Each loss tightened the noose around Japan's defensive perimeter, exposing its inner lines to American strikes. Even victories, like those at Savo Island, had proven fleeting, overshadowed by the crushing defeats that followed. Fuel shortages hampered training, and Japan's industrial base lagged far behind America's. What had begun as a confident campaign to dominate the Pacific now became a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, stood at a crossroads: fight and risk annihilation, or retreat and concede defeat. Neither option promised survival. The defeat at Midway carried consequences far beyond the loss of ships. It represented the shattering of a dream that had guided Japanese naval doctrine for decades: the decisive battle strategy. For years, Japanese planners believed that one great fleet action would determine the fate of the war, just as the Battle of Tsushima had decided the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Midway had been that battle, but its outcome destroyed not the Americans but the Japanese. The loss of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, meant the destruction of Japan's most valuable naval assets. Even more devastating was the death of hundreds of veteran aviators, men who could not be replaced. The rigorous training pipeline that had once produced elite pilots could no longer keep pace with losses. By 1943, Japan was forced to rush young, inexperienced recruits into combat, men with only a fraction of the training their predecessors had enjoyed. The decline in quality was sharp and irreversible. Midway was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of Japan's unraveling at sea. The long and bitter campaign in the Solomon Islands deepened Japan's naval crisis. At Guadalcanal, the Navy fought desperately to dislodge American Marines, committing battleships, carriers, and cruisers in repeated clashes. Though they inflicted heavy losses, the Japanese paid a price they could not afford. The battles of the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the naval battle of Guadalcanal drained the imperial fleet of ships and aviators alike. Carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku fought valiantly, but lost wave after wave of skilled flyers. The famed Zero fighter, once the terror of the Pacific, was outclassed by newer American aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat. Supply shortages further crippled Japanese operations, with long supply lines from Rabaul and Truk unable to sustain offensive action. The Solomons became a graveyard for Japan's naval power, a campaign that consumed lives and ships without yielding victory. By the time the Japanese abandoned Guadalcanal in early 1943, their naval supremacy was broken. The Solomons had proven what Midway had hinted: Japan could not match American endurance. The loss of Truk Lagoon in early 1944, often called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, delivered another staggering blow to Japanese naval strategy. Truk had long been the forward anchor of Japan's Pacific defenses, a base for carriers, battleships, and logistics. When American carrier task forces struck in Operation Hailstone in February 1944, the results were devastating. Dozens of ships were sunk, aircraft destroyed on the ground, and the once formidable base rendered useless. The Japanese fleet withdrew to safer waters, losing its ability to project power across the Central Pacific. Without Truk, Japan's naval mobility was crippled. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, as tankers were hunted down by American submarines, leaving ships stranded or unable to train. The proud vision of an aggressive, outward-reaching navy had collapsed into a defensive crouch. Japan's perimeter, once stretching to the Gilberts and beyond, now shrank toward the Marianas. Truk's fall symbolized more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe that sealed Japan's declining fortunes at sea. In the face of these losses, the Japanese Navy turned to Operation Eigo, a desperate gamble to halt the American advance in the Central Pacific. Planned as early as 1943, Eigo envisioned luring the American fleet into battle near the Marianas, where Japanese carriers and land-based aircraft could deliver a crushing blow. On paper, it was the decisive battle doctrine resurrected, a last chance to repeat the miracle of Pearl Harbor or Tsushima. In reality, it was an act of desperation built on illusion. Japan lacked the experienced pilots, the carrier strength, and the fuel reserves to sustain such a campaign. Yet the High Command believed that honor demanded a fight, no matter the odds. The Marianas became the chosen battleground, for their loss would expose Japan's homeland to American bombers. To defend them, the Japanese Navy staked what remained of its fleet. It was a strategy born not of strength, but of necessity. Eigo would be Japan's final bid for supremacy in the Pacific. The decline of Japanese naval air power was perhaps the most decisive factor leading into the Philippine Sea. By 1944, most of the elite aviators who had flown at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea and Midway were gone. Their replacements had often received less than 100 hours of flight training compared to the 700 or more logged by American pilots. Many had never even practiced carrier landings before being thrown into combat. In contrast, American aviators benefited from extensive training, modern aircraft, and combat experience gained in the Solomons and Central Pacific campaigns. The imbalance was staggering. Japan fielded aircraft, but not aviators capable of matching the enemy. Losses at Rabaul and Truk had further eroded confidence, leaving Japan's flyers both inexperienced and demoralized. The samurai spirit so often invoked in propaganda could not replace skill and preparation. The skies that once belonged to the Zero now favored the Hellcat. In the Philippine Sea, this imbalance would prove catastrophic. Japan's logistical crisis compounded its naval weakness. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes with ruthless efficiency, sinking tankers and cargo ships that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies. By mid-1944, fuel shortages were so severe that Japanese carriers often remained in port, conserving precious reserves for the expected decisive battle. Training flights were curtailed and naval maneuvers reduced, leaving ships and crews unprepared for large-scale operations. The Americans, by contrast, enjoyed abundant oil from California and the Persian Gulf, delivered safely across secure sea lanes. Every engagement drained Japanese reserves further, creating a vicious cycle of weakness. Even when ships sailed, they often did so with only partial fuel tanks, limiting their range and flexibility. For the first time in its history, the Imperial Navy faced not only an enemy stronger than itself, but also the crippling weight of shortages. The Japanese knew they were approaching the endgame, yet still, they prepared to fight. Desperation drove them into the Philippine Sea. By June 1944, Japan's war stood at a crossroads, balanced precariously between defiance and disaster. The losses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and Truk had crippled its naval power, leaving it a hollow shadow of the force that had once stunned the world. Yet pride, tradition, and desperation compelled the High Command to gamble everything on one last decisive battle. The Marianas were chosen as the arena, their fall too dangerous to contemplate. Operation Eigo promised salvation but risked annihilation, a final throw of the dice in a game already lost. Japan's sailors and aviators sailed into the Philippine Sea, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. For them, the coming battle was not only about strategy, but about honor, duty, and survival. The United States prepared to meet them with unmatched power and confidence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Pacific. At this crossroads, Japan chose to fight. History would remember it as a gamble that sealed their doom. By early 1944, The United States had developed a grand strategy to break through the remaining layers of Japan's Pacific defenses and position itself for direct strikes on the Japanese homeland. This plan, codenamed Operation Forager, envisioned the seizure of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam as the next great stepping stones across the Central Pacific. At the heart of the strategy lay the recognition that control of the Marianas would allow the United States to deploy the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers. These massive aircraft, capable of flying higher, farther, and carrying heavier payloads than any before, could strike at Tokyo itself from bases in the Marianas. For Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean areas, the capture of these islands was not simply about territory, it was about changing the very geometry of the war. The plan would require unprecedented coordination of Navy, Marine, and Army forces, supported by an industrial base producing ships and planes at breathtaking speed. Operation Forager became the most ambitious amphibious operation yet attempted in the Pacific. Its success would open the door to Japan's defeat. Its failure would prolong the war at terrible cost. The blueprint for Forager reflected the lessons learned from earlier campaigns, particularly Tarawa in 1943 and the Marshalls in early 1944. American planners understood that amphibious operations against fortified islands required not only overwhelming force, but meticulous preparation. Saipan, the first objective, would be the most difficult as its rugged terrain, Japanese garrison of 30,000 troops, and civilian population of more than 20,000 posed unique challenges. Tinian, lying just a few miles south of Saipan, offered flat terrain ideal for airfields, but was also heavily defended. Guam, the largest of the Marianas and a former U.S. possession captured by Japan in 1941, carried both symbolic and strategic importance. The plan envisioned sequential invasions, first Saipan, then Tinian, and finally Guam, each island falling like a domino. To succeed, the operation would require naval supremacy, air superiority, and logistical mastery on a scale never before attempted. Every detail, from the timing of bombardments to the flow of landing craft, had to be considered. Forager would be the proving ground for America's growing mastery of amphibious warfare. Admiral Nimitz entrusted overall operational command to Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet. Spruance, known for his calm, analytical demeanor, had already proven his brilliance at the Battle of Midway, where his cautious but decisive leadership contributed to America's stunning victory. For Forager, Spruance would oversee the coordination of land, sea, and air forces, ensuring that the invasion was protected from Japanese counterattacks. He relied heavily on Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell, commander of Task Force 58, the fast carrier striking arm that would shield the invasion fleet. Mitchell, a visionary in naval aviation, commanded the most powerful concentration of carriers and aircraft the world had ever seen. His task force would neutralize Japanese bases, protect the amphibious landings, and if necessary, confront the Japanese fleet. Working alongside Spruance and Mitchell were Marine generals Holland Howland Mad, Smith and Roy Geiger, who would lead the assault troops ashore. Together, this command team represented the synthesis of naval and amphibious expertise. Their unity of purpose was critical to Forager's success. Each man understood the enormous stakes of the operation. The forces assembled for Operation Forager reflected the sheer scale of American war production by mid-1944. Task Force 58 alone boasted 15 carriers, 7 fast battleships, dozens of cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers and support vessels. In total, the invasion fleet numbered over 500 ships, carrying more than 127,000 Marines and soldiers. The firepower they could bring to bear was staggering, naval guns that could pulverize beaches, aircraft that could bomb and strafe for hours, and amphibious vehicles that could storm coral reefs and rocky shores. The logistical effort to sustain such a force was equally monumental. Tankers carried millions of gallons of fuel, supply ships hauled ammunition, rations and spare parts, and hospital ships waited offshore to receive the wounded. It was a floating city of war, an armada that stretched horizon to horizon. Never before had so much power been concentrated in one place in the Pacific. Operation Forager was not just a military campaign, it was an industrial miracle. Every ship, plane and rifle reflected the factories, shipyards and assembly lines back home. For the Americans, the capture of the Marianas was about more than strategy. It was about reshaping the war itself. From airfields on Saipan and Tinian, B-29 bombers could bypass Japan's defensive perimeter entirely, flying directly to the heart of the empire. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. Cities once thought safe from direct attack would now be within range. The Japanese High Command understood this, and declared that the defense of the Marianas was vital to the survival of the empire. For the United States, this reality only reinforced the importance of Forager. If successful, it would accelerate Japan's defeat by months, perhaps years. It would also demonstrate to the world that America could carry the war across the Pacific with unstoppable momentum. Forager was therefore not simply about islands, it was about transforming geography into a weapon. The Marianas represented the turning of the tide, from containment and attrition to direct assault on the Japanese homeland. The stakes could not have been higher. Victory would change the Pacific War forever. Planning for Forager demanded a balance between caution and boldness. Nimitz and Spruance knew that the Japanese would not yield the Marianas without a fight, and they expected a major naval counterattack. The invasion could only succeed if Task Force 58 neutralized Japanese air power in the region. This required pre-invasion strikes on islands like Pagan, Rota and Iwo Jima, as well as raids on the Bonins and Carolines to prevent reinforcements. Mitchell's carriers launched relentless raids in the weeks leading up to the landings, softening defenses and probing for weaknesses. Submarines scouted Japanese fleet movements, reporting back to Spruance with critical intelligence. At the same time, amphibious rehearsals trained Marines and soldiers in the art of landing under fire. Logistics officers worked tirelessly to ensure that supplies would flow without interruption. Every piece of the puzzle had to fall into place. Operation Forager was not just a battle plan, it was a symphony of coordination. Despite the thoroughness of American planning, uncertainty hung over Forager like a storm cloud. Japanese strength in the Marianas was estimated but not fully known, and the possibility of massive resistance remained. The island's rugged terrain, with volcanic ridges and caves, promised a bitter fight even if the beaches were taken. Civilian populations complicated matters further, raising questions about how to handle non-combatants caught in the crossfire. There was also the looming specter of the Japanese fleet. Though weakened, it remained a formidable force, and intelligence suggested it would sortie to meet the Americans in battle. Spruance and Mitchell prepared for this possibility, but neither underestimated the risks. They knew that a naval clash could decide the campaign before the Marines even reached shore. Forager was thus not only an amphibious operation, but a high-stakes gamble at sea. The Americans marched forward with confidence, but also with caution. The Pacific had a way of turning certainty into chaos. The Marianas would be no exception. Operation Forager represented the culmination of America's island-hopping campaign and the embodiment of its strategic vision in the Pacific. It drew upon every lesson learned, every resource built, and every life lost in the long journey from Pearl Harbor to the Marshalls. Nimitz, Spruance, and Mitchell brought with them the confidence of a nation that had mobilized fully for war. Yet they also carried the weight of responsibility, knowing that the fate of thousands of men and the trajectory of the Pacific War itself rested on their decisions. As the invasion fleet steamed toward the Marianas in June 1944, the vast armada symbolized not only military power but national resolve. Behind every ship and plane stood a nation united, determined to end the war. The Americans knew they were about to provoke the largest carrier battle in history. In the Philippine Sea, Operation Forager would meet Operation Ago. The clash that followed would decide far more than islands. It would decide the future of the Pacific War. In the spring of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy clung to a final hope of reversing its fading fortunes, Operation Ago. This ambitious plan called for a decisive naval battle, fought on Japan's terms, that would cripple the advancing American fleet and preserve the empire's defensive perimeter. At its core was the traditional doctrine of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle concept that had guided Japanese naval thinking for decades. Ever since Admiral Togor's stunning victory over the Russians at Tsushima in 1905, Japanese strategists believed that wars at sea were won not by attrition, but by a single climactic encounter. For 2 years, Japan had delayed such a confrontation, hoping to whittle down American strength through attritional campaigns in the Solomons and New Guinea. But now, with the Marianas threatened, the time for delay was over. If Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell, the Japanese homeland itself would come under direct threat. Operation Ago thus represented not just a military maneuver, but a last stand. It was Japan's gamble to restore honor and shift the balance of the Pacific. The architects of Operation Ago envisioned a sweeping, coordinated strike that would combine carrier aviation with land-based air power. Japanese carriers would sortie from the Philippines and anchor near the Marianas, drawing the American fleet into battle. Meanwhile, hundreds of land-based aircraft stationed on Guam, Saipan, and other outposts would join the fray, supplementing the carriers' striking power. Together they hoped this combined force would overwhelm American defenses, inflict catastrophic losses, and force the U.S. Navy to retreat. The plan also counted on the vast distances of the Pacific to favor Japan, as supply lines strained the Americans, while Japan's bases, though battered, could still provide support. Admiral Manishi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, had conceived the plan before his untimely death in March 1944, and it fell to his successor, Admiral Seimu Toyoda, to put it into action. Toyoda believed Ago offered the Empire one last chance at victory. It was bold, ambitious, and infused with Japan's spirit of desperation, yet it rested on fragile foundations. At the heart of the plan stood Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's carrier striking force. Ozawa, an experienced and respected officer, had inherited a fleet that was powerful on paper but hollow in reality. His carriers included Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, alongside veterans like Shokaku, Zuikaku, Jinyu, and Heiyo. Supporting them were smaller carriers, and a handful of battleships and cruisers. But beneath this impressive roster lay severe weaknesses, inexperienced pilots, shortages of fuel, and fragile logistics. Unlike the seasoned aviators of Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea, Ozawa's flyers were mostly raw recruits, rushed through training with minimal flight hours. Many had never landed on a carrier deck in combat conditions. Their aircraft, though improved models like the A6M50 and the D4Y Judy, could not match the robust F-6F Hellcats flown by American pilots. Ozawa understood these shortcomings, but he also knew the stakes. To him, Operation Ago was not just about strategy, it was about survival. His fleet was the Empire's last sword. The Japanese High Command believed that land-based aircraft would compensate for the carrier's shortcomings. Hundreds of planes were stationed on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, intended to augment Ozawa's strike groups and provide a decisive edge. Yet here, too, illusions clouded reality. American raids had already devastated many of these airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and scattering veteran crews. The replacements who flew to the Marianas were often untrained, arriving with little more than the will to fight. Fuel shortages further limited the number of sorties they could launch. Coordination between land-based and carrier aviation, never a strong suit of the Japanese Navy, was tenuous at best. Still, Tokyo placed enormous faith in these forces, believing they would tip the balance in favor of Japan. In reality, they would become little more than cannon fodder. The Japanese hope for a decisive battle rested on forces already crippled before the fight began. Operation Ago was built on fragile illusions. Fuel was perhaps the greatest constraint on Operation Ago. By mid-1944, Japan's oil supply from the Dutch East Indies was dwindling, strangled by relentless US submarine attacks on tankers. Every sortie of a carrier or battleship consumed fuel reserves that could not be easily replaced. Ozawa's fleet, though impressive in appearance, often sailed with only partially filled tanks. This drastically limited operational flexibility and left little margin for prolonged combat. It also meant that Japanese carriers could not engage in extended training or rehearsals, leaving inexperienced aviators even less prepared for the realities of battle. American fleets, fueled by secure and abundant supply lines, enjoyed freedom of movement that Japan could no longer match. Every mile Ozawa's fleet sailed was a gamble of precious resources. Operation Ago was therefore not just a gamble in strategy, it was a gamble in logistics. Japan was betting the last of its fuel on one battle. The risks of Ago were apparent even to its architects. Intelligence reports warned that the Americans possessed overwhelming carrier strength, perhaps more than Japan could ever hope to match. Radar, a technology the Japanese still lacked in effective numbers, gave the US a decisive edge in detecting incoming strikes. Submarines lurked beneath the waves, threatening to ambush Japanese carriers as they had at Midway. Yet the Japanese High Command pressed forward, driven by desperation and a sense of inevitability. For them, the Marianas represented the line that could not be crossed. If they retreated without fighting, the Empire would be encircled and bombarded at will. Better to risk annihilation than to concede without battle. Ago was thus as much about honor as it was about strategy. The plan carried within it the seeds of catastrophe. But in the eyes of Japan's leaders, catastrophe was preferable to surrender. To prepare for Ago, Japanese forces assembled at anchorages in the Philippines and the inland sea. Crews drilled as best they could, though shortages of fuel and time limited their readiness. Young aviators, some barely out of training schools, were told they would participate in a battle that would decide the fate of the Empire. Propaganda filled the air, declaring that the Americans would finally meet their doom in the Philippine Sea. Spirits were high, but beneath the surface lurked anxiety and doubt. Senior officers knew their flyers could not match the seasoned Americans, but they dared not voice such fears openly. Instead, they embraced the samurai ethos, convincing themselves that spirit and courage could offset inexperience and weakness. Ozawa himself maintained a calm, professional demeanor, even as he privately questioned his pilot's readiness. The fleet sailed with banners of defiance, but hearts heavy with uncertainty. Japan was throwing its last card onto the table. Operation Eigo thus represented both Japan's boldest hope and its greatest risk. It was a strategy rooted in tradition, driven by desperation, and executed with forces unprepared for the challenge they faced. The Japanese high command believed that one decisive victory could halt the American advance, preserve the empire's defensive perimeter, and perhaps open the door to negotiated peace. But in reality, they were sending untested pilots, fuel-starved ships, and battered carriers into a confrontation with the most powerful fleet ever assembled. The risks were monumental, and the odds heavily against them. Yet the Japanese sailed anyway, driven by the knowledge that retreat meant certain defeat. The Marianas became their chosen battlefield, the place where they would stake everything on one final gamble. History would remember Operation Eigo not as salvation, but as desperation. Its failure would shatter Japan's naval air power forever. The Philippine Sea was about to become the graveyard of the Japanese carrier fleet. By June 1944, the United States Navy had become the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, a leviathan of steel and aviation that spanned the Pacific. At the core of this strength stood Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell, a pioneer of naval aviation. Task Force 58 was not a single fleet, but a massive striking arm divided into 4 task groups, each built around fast carriers and their escorts. Together they formed a war machine of breathtaking scale: 15 aircraft carriers, 7 modern battleships, dozens of cruisers, and scores of destroyers. Their combined firepower represented the industrial might of the United States, which by 1944 was producing ships, planes, and munitions faster than any enemy could destroy them. The sight of Task Force 58 steaming across the ocean was awe-inspiring, a moving city of steel stretching from horizon to horizon. Every ship had its role, some to launch planes, some to hurl shells, others to protect the fleet against submarines and aircraft. This was a navy designed for total war. Against it, Japan's fleet looked small, fragile, and outdated. At the heart of Task Force 58 were the Essex-class carriers, the backbone of American naval aviation. These ships, longer than 2 football fields, carried nearly 100 aircraft each, ranging from the rugged F-6F Hellcat fighter to the deadly SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber and the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. With armored flight decks, powerful anti-aircraft batteries, and sophisticated repair facilities, they were designed not only to fight, but to survive. Unlike Japan's carriers, which often succumbed to a single well-placed bomb or torpedo, the Essex class could absorb punishment and return to action. Their flight operations were a model of efficiency, launching and recovering dozens of planes in tightly choreographed sequences. Around the clock, their decks thundered with the roar of engines, while crews below prepared fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Each carrier was a floating airfield, a self-sustaining fortress of aviation. By 1944, there were more than a dozen Essex-class carriers in service, with more under construction. They symbolized America's industrial supremacy and technological ingenuity. For Japan, facing such ships meant fighting against the future itself. Supporting the carriers were the fast battleships, symbols of naval power reborn in the age of aviation. The Iowa-class and South Dakota-class battleships, with their 16-inch guns, provided both protection and heavy bombardment. Once considered obsolete by the rise of carriers, these ships now served as guardians of the fleet, screening against surface threats and raining destruction on shore defenses. Their speed allowed them to keep pace with the carriers, a revolution in naval design that ensured the fleet moved as a cohesive unit. At Saipan and throughout the Central Pacific, Their guns softened Japanese defenses before Marines stormed ashore. They also provided anti-aircraft fire, their decks bristling with 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 40 Bofors batteries. Together with cruisers and destroyers, they created a wall of steel and fire around the carriers. To the men aboard, these ships represented confidence and invulnerability. To Japan, they were another layer of defense to penetrate before reaching the carriers. Task Force 58's might was not only in its planes, but in its guns. It was a fleet without weakness. Perhaps the most unsung heroes of Task Force 58 were the submarines that operated ahead of the main fleet. Silent, patient, and lethal, American submarines prowled Japanese waters, scouting enemy movements and striking at vital targets. By 1944, U.S. subs had grown into one of the most effective weapons of the Pacific War, sinking Japanese tankers, freighters, and even capital ships. Their role in the Philippine Sea would be crucial, as submarines like Albacore and Kavala intercepted Japanese carriers at decisive moments. They extended the eyes and ears of the fleet, providing intelligence that shaped strategy. Submarine crews endured grueling conditions, cramped quarters, stale air, and the constant threat of depth charges, but their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. By cutting Japan's supply lines, they strangled the empire's fuel reserves and reduced its fleet to a hollow force. Submarines were the hidden dagger of Task Force 58. They ensured that when the decisive battle came, Japan would fight not at full strength, but already weakened. What truly distinguished Task Force 58, however, was its mastery of radar technology. American carriers and ships were equipped with advanced air search radars, capable of detecting incoming enemy aircraft at long distances. This technological edge allowed U.S. commanders to track enemy strikes before they arrived, vectoring Hellcats into position to intercept them. Japanese planes, once feared for their speed and maneuverability, now found themselves ambushed before they even reached the fleet. Radar also coordinated the fleet's layered defenses, directing anti-aircraft fire with deadly precision. At night, radar gave the Americans an additional advantage, guiding planes back to their carriers in darkness and allowing ships to detect enemy vessels. No longer did fleets rely on the naked eye or guesswork. Science and electronics reshaped naval warfare. Radar was the invisible shield of Task Force 58, a weapon as decisive as bombs or torpedoes. Japan, lagging behind in radar development, entered the Philippine Sea blind compared to its opponent. The result would be catastrophic. Behind the hardware of Task Force 58 stood the human factor, American pilots and crews, whose training and morale far outmatched their adversaries. Each Hellcat pilot had undergone hundreds of flight hours, rigorous training in gunnery, and simulated combat before ever seeing battle. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns, carrying valuable experience into the skies. In contrast, Japanese aviators in 1944 were often barely out of training schools, with little more than enthusiasm to guide them. The result was an air war of brutal imbalance, where skill and preparation counted as much as numbers. On the carriers, deck crews worked tirelessly, refueling and rearming planes under the hot Pacific sun, often with little sleep. Damage control teams drilled constantly, ensuring ships could survive hits that might otherwise sink them. Task Force 58 was a finely tuned machine, each sailor and pilot a cog in a vast coordinated effort. Their discipline and professionalism turned overwhelming firepower into unstoppable momentum. Japan would soon discover that courage alone could not overcome training and experience. Logistics was the lifeblood of Task Force 58, and it gave the Americans a strategic advantage Japan could never match. Fleet oilers refueled carriers and battleships at sea, allowing the task force to remain on station indefinitely. Supply ships carried mountains of ammunition, spare parts, and food, ensuring that the fleet never ran dry. Hospital ships stood ready to treat the wounded, while repair ships fixed battle damage without forcing carriers back to port. This logistical network extended across the Pacific from Hawaii to forward bases like Eniwetok and Kwajalein, each step a link in an unbroken chain. Japan, dependent on vulnerable oil convoys from the Dutch East Indies, could not hope to match such flexibility. The ability to sustain operations at sea for weeks at a time meant that Task Force 58 could strike anywhere, anytime, with overwhelming force. Logistics transformed the Pacific into an American ocean. For every shell fired and every bomb dropped, there was a supply ship ensuring more would follow. The U.S. Navy had mastered not only combat but endurance. Task Force 58 was thus far more than a collection of ships. It was the embodiment of American industrial might, technological innovation, and human skill. Under Admiral Mark Mitcher's steady leadership, it represented a war machine capable of both defense and offense on an unprecedented scale. The carriers brought the skies under American control, the battleships and cruisers guarded the seas, the submarines struck in the shadows, and radar knitted it all together. Behind it lay an industrial nation producing more carriers, more planes, and more men than Japan could ever replace. For the Japanese, facing Task Force 58 was not merely a battle, it was a confrontation with inevitability. The might of the U.S. Navy was overwhelming, and it was only growing stronger with every passing month. The Philippine Sea would be the proving ground for this power. In its steel decks and roaring engines lay the fate of the Pacific War. Task Force 58 was ready. The question was whether Japan would survive the encounter. In June 1944, Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese Mobile Fleet, found himself at the helm of a force that looked formidable on paper, but was riddled with weaknesses. Ozawa, nicknamed the Gentleman Admiral for his calm demeanor and humane leadership style, was respected by his men but painfully aware of the fleet's fragility. His command included 9 aircraft carriers, organized into task groups intended to project Japan's air power into the Philippine Sea. Among them was Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, boasting an armored flight deck and modern design. Alongside it sailed the veteran fleet carriers Shokaku and Zukaku, survivors of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and countless other battles. Supporting them were the carriers Haiho, Junyu, and several light carriers, including Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuku. To outside observers, this fleet represented the concentrated might of Japan's remaining naval aviation. But Ozawa knew the truth. His ships were shells of their former glory. Their decks carried inexperienced pilots, their tanks held dwindling fuel, and their survival depended on a gamble Japan could scarcely afford. The composition of Ozawa's fleet revealed both ambition and desperation. On paper, he commanded more than 400 carrier-based aircraft, including the A-6M50 fighters, D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and B-6N Jill torpedo bombers. These were supplemented by hundreds of land-based planes stationed on Guam, Saipan, and other islands in the Marianas. Together, they were intended to form a hammer blow against the Americans, overwhelming even the powerful Task Force 58. But in practice, this combined air arm was fatally flawed. Most of the carrier aviators were young, barely trained recruits, some with as little as 100 flight hours. Many had never executed a carrier landing under combat conditions. Their machines, though modern in theory, often suffered from mechanical issues and lacked the durability of American aircraft. Inexperience, shortages, and poor coordination all weakened Ozawa's striking arm. His carriers carried planes, but not the men to fly them effectively. The fleet's power was an illusion, shimmering like a mirage in the tropical heat. Ozawa's reliance on land-based air support was another critical vulnerability. The Japanese High Command had assured him that hundreds of aircraft stationed on Guam, Tinian, and Rota would reinforce his carriers. These planes were to join in massed strikes, creating a combined blow that would shatter the American fleet. But American raids in the days before the battle devastated these bases, destroying scores of planes on the ground and leaving many runways cratered. Pilots who survived the bombings were often inexperienced or exhausted, having flown from distant islands under poor logistical support. Coordination between land-based and carrier forces had never been a Japanese strength, and now it was nearly impossible. Radios were unreliable, and doctrine for joint operations was poorly developed. In reality, Ozawa could count on only a fraction of the promised support. His fleet sailed into the Philippine Sea under the assumption of reinforcements that would never fully materialize. The reliance on land-based planes was a gamble that would backfire disastrously. The Japanese carriers themselves presented a mixed picture of capability and vulnerability. Taihu, launched only months earlier, symbolized Japan's attempt to modernize, with heavy armor and improved facilities. Yet it carried flaws of design and crew training, as would soon become fatally evident. The veteran Shikaku and Zuikaku still inspired pride, having survived Midway, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, but both were scarred veterans, patched and battered by years of combat. The light carriers, Chaitos, Chiyoda, and Zuihu, were converted seaplane tenders, far less capable of sustained operations compared to American Essex-class giants. Maintenance issues plagued all of them, compounded by fuel shortages that limited training and flight readiness. Their escorts included battleships like Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, but even these leviathans were less relevant in a war dominated by carriers. On the surface, the fleet glittered with power, but beneath the paint and armor lay weakness. Ozawa commanded a fleet that could not replace its losses. Each ship lost would be irreplaceable. Fuel shortages cast a long shadow over every decision Ozawa made. Japan's oil supplies from the Dutch East Indies were dwindling, choked off by relentless American submarine attacks. Tankers had become prime targets, and their destruction left carriers and battleships with only partial reserves. To conserve fuel, the Japanese Navy restricted training flights, meaning aviators entered battle without the experience to handle emergencies. Ships often sailed at reduced speeds, conserving every drop of precious fuel. This lack of mobility limited Ozawa's ability to maneuver freely, forcing him to commit to engagements rather than retreat when needed. By contrast, the Americans enjoyed vast logistical chains, with oilers and supply ships sustaining their fleets indefinitely. For Japan, every mile steamed into the Philippine Sea was a mile that could not be retraced without consequence. The gamble of Operation Ago consumed fuel reserves that could never be replenished. Ozawa's fleet sailed into the battle with empty margins. Fuel shortages turned bold strategy into reckless desperation. Morale among the Japanese sailors and pilots reflected this uneasy reality. Many of the young aviators believed in the spirit of Bushido, the samurai ethos of courage and sacrifice, and accepted their mission as one of near-certain death. Propaganda painted the battle as Japan's great chance to turn the tide, inflaming both pride and fatalism. Yet the veterans, the few who remained from Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea, understood the imbalance they faced. They knew their replacements lacked the skill and training to compete with hardened American pilots. They also knew that losses could not be replaced. On the carriers, Tension was palpable as crews readied for a confrontation that might annihilate them. Ozawa, calm and professional, did what he could to steady his men, though privately he harbored doubts. He faced an impossible task to inspire confidence while commanding a fleet weaker than it appeared. The morale of the Japanese fleet was a fragile mask. Beneath it lay resignation. Ozawa's strategic approach reflected both caution and obligation. He sought to position his fleet to the west of the Marianas, where he could strike at the Americans while remaining within range of land-based support. His hope was to lure Mitch's carriers into range, forcing the Americans to fight on Japanese terms. Yet this meant relying on timing, coordination, and pilots who lacked the training to deliver precise, devastating blows. Unlike Midway or Pearl Harbor, where veteran aviators had carried out brilliantly coordinated attacks, the Philippine Sea would be fought by novices against professionals. The imbalance was stark, yet Ozawa had no alternative. Retreat was not an option. The Marianas were too vital to abandon. He knew the risks, but the High Command demanded action. Operation Ago was the fleet's duty, regardless of its readiness. Ozawa would commit his forces to battle, even if it meant destruction. His orders were clear: fight to save the empire. Thus, by mid-June 1944, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Chisaburo Ozawa sailed into the Philippine Sea with hope, desperation, and illusion in equal measure. On the surface, his carriers, battleships, and cruisers represented a formidable force, one that appeared capable of meeting the American fleet head-on. Yet beneath that surface lay the truth: fuel shortages, untrained aviators, crippled logistics, and shattered land-based support. Ozawa knew the odds but had no choice. The Marianas had to be defended at any cost. Japan was gambling not only its fleet, but its very survival. Operation Ago was more than a plan. It was a last roll of the dice for the Empire. The carriers moved forward, their decks crowded with planes and their crews bracing for combat. In their wake trailed the hopes of a nation unwilling to surrender. Ahead lay the most decisive carrier battle in history. Ozawa's fleet was prepared to fight, but not prepared to win. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was at its core a contest of men in machines, aviators who soared into the skies carrying the hopes of their nations. By 1944, the differences between American and Japanese naval pilots had grown so stark that the outcome of aerial combat was all but predetermined. American aviators of Task Force 58 were products of a rigorous structured training system honed by combat experience across the Pacific. They had flown over Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Marshalls, surviving deadly battles and sharpening their skills. Their Japanese counterparts, once the terror of the Pacific skies, were now mostly inexperienced recruits, rushed through training programs, gutted by shortages of time, fuel, and instructors. The elite cadre that had struck at Pearl Harbor and fought at Midway was gone, lost to attrition and irreplaceable. In their place came boys barely out of flight school, some with less than 100 hours in the cockpit. This imbalance in experience was devastating. The pilots who faced each other over the Philippine Sea belonged to two entirely different worlds. The American pilot training program was a marvel of organization and discipline. By 1944, the US Navy had perfected a system that began with ground school, advanced through flight training, and culminated in specialized carrier qualification. Each aviator logged hundreds of hours in the air, practicing gunnery, bombing, navigation, and night landings. The process was long, demanding, and unforgiving, ensuring that only the best graduated to combat units. Carrier landing practice was relentless, with trainees forced to master the art of landing on a moving deck or wash out of the program. Beyond training, American pilots benefited from realistic simulations of combat, where instructors recreated scenarios they had encountered in earlier battles. This system produced flyers who not only knew their aircraft but also understood how to fight as part of a coordinated team. By the time they launched from the decks of an Essex-class carrier, they were skilled professionals, confident in themselves and their comrades. Their training was not just preparation, it was survival insurance. By contrast, the Japanese training system had collapsed under the strain of war. In the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aviators had been among the most elite in the world. They trained for years, logging extensive hours in the air, mastering navigation, formation, flying, and gunnery with unmatched precision. But those rigorous standards required time and resources that Japan no longer had by 1943. The losses at Midway, Guadalcanal and Rabaul stripped the Imperial Navy of its best instructors and its most experienced combat pilots. Training pipelines were shortened drastically, sometimes producing pilots after only a few months of instruction. Many new aviators entered combat without ever practicing carrier landings, learning only when faced with the chaos of battle. Their gunnery was poor, their navigation unreliable, and their ability to operate as part of a unit severely limited. They carried courage in their hearts, but skill could not be improvised. Japan's aviators were brave but tragically unprepared. The imbalance extended beyond training into the machines they flew. American pilots in 1944 flew the Grumman Furries 6F Hellcat, an aircraft designed specifically to counter the famed Japanese Zero. The Hellcat was faster, more heavily armed, and more durable, able to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter planes. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, giving it overwhelming firepower in dogfights. The Zero, though legendary in 1941, had become outdated by 1944. Its agility was still impressive, but its lack of armor, limited firepower, and vulnerability to diving attacks left it fatally exposed. Japanese bombers, such as the Judy dive bomber and Jill torpedo bomber, were fragile and slow compared to American interceptors. In the Philippine Sea, this mismatch of planes compounded the imbalance of pilots. The Americans flew into battle with the best tools technology could provide. The Japanese entered with aircraft that belonged to a past age of the war. In combat, the results would be brutal and swift. Tactics reflected these differences in training and equipment. American aviators flew in disciplined formations, relying on mutual support and coordinated maneuvers. Radar guidance vectored them toward incoming raids, ensuring they engaged the enemy with tactical advantage. Once in combat, Hellcat pilots used their superior firepower and diving speed to shred enemy formations. They were trained to conserve energy, maintain altitude, and avoid risky duels. Japanese pilots, by contrast, often relied on outdated tactics that emphasized individual skill and maneuverability. Their formations frequently broke apart under pressure, leaving bombers unprotected. Lacking radar, they flew blindly into ambushes, only realizing the danger when American fighters fell upon them. Coordination between fighters and bombers was poor, resulting in unescorted attacks that stood little chance of success. The skies above the Philippine Sea became a brutal classroom where these differences were laid bare. Discipline and technology defeated courage and improvisation. The tactics of war favored the Americans absolutely. Morale told another part of the story. American aviators, though hardened by combat, were buoyed by confidence in their training, their aircraft, and their fleet. They knew reinforcements and replacements stood behind them, ensuring that even losses could be absorbed. They were well-fed, well-rested, and sustained by a logistical system that kept their squadrons supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Japanese aviators, by contrast, carried the burden of inevitability. They knew their losses could not be replaced, that every comrade lost was a hole that would never be filled. Many approached missions with a fatalistic acceptance, embracing the samurai ethos of sacrifice, rather than expecting survival. On the carriers, nervous young flyers looked to their commanders for reassurance, but found only grim determination. They were told that the fate of the empire rested on their shoulders, a crushing weight for pilots barely trained. Courage was abundant, but morale was brittle. The skies above the Marianas would break many before combat even began. The experience gap between the two sides could not be overstated. American squadrons included aces with dozens of kills, men who had survived the crucible of Guadalcanal and the Solomons. They brought with them lessons learned in blood, how to spot ambushes, how to counter zero tactics, how to fight and live another day. Japanese squadrons, in contrast, were filled with novices, often led by young officers with no more experience than the men they commanded. The veterans who might have mentored them had long since been lost in earlier battles. This lack of institutional knowledge crippled Japan's air arm. In aerial combat, seconds meant survival, and experience provided instincts that training could not replace. American pilots entered dogfights with confidence. Japanese pilots entered with uncertainty. The skies became an uneven battlefield where professionals faced amateurs. In such conditions, the outcome was never in doubt. Experience was the invisible weapon the Americans carried. By June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was already decided in the skies before the fleets ever clashed. The Americans possessed better training, better aircraft, superior tactics, and unmatched experience. The Japanese, once the masters of naval aviation, entered the fight with courage, but without the tools or preparation to prevail. The imbalance would become legendary, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where waves of Japanese aircraft were annihilated with minimal American losses. But behind that phrase lay the human truth. Young Japanese pilots, brave yet unready, perished by the hundreds, while seasoned American aviators secured dominance with ruthless efficiency. The Philippine Sea was not just a clash of machines, but a clash of systems, one thriving, one collapsing. The skies told the story of Japan's decline and America's ascendancy. In the air, the war had already been won. The pilots' war was the decisive factor, and it would seal the fate of the Japanese carrier fleet forever. While carriers and aircraft dominated the headlines of the Pacific War, the silent hunters of the U.S. submarine force played a decisive role in shaping the outcome of the Philippine Sea. By 1944, American submarines had become the unseen eyes and daggers of the fleet, prowling the vast Pacific with lethal efficiency. They scouted enemy movements, reported intelligence, and struck at Japanese warships and tankers with deadly torpedoes. Their presence forced the Japanese to sail nervously, never certain if a periscope was lurking just beneath the waves. In the lead-up to the battle, these submarines provided Admiral Spruance with critical intelligence on the movements of Ozawa's carrier fleet. Japanese communications were also monitored by codebreakers, but it was the submarines that offered confirmation in steel and salt water. They shadowed the enemy, closing the gap between radio intercepts and reality. Without their reports, Task Force 58 would have been blind in the Philippine Sea. Submarines in 1944 were not auxiliary forces, they were vital instruments of victory. American submarine doctrine had evolved dramatically since the early days of the war. At first, technical problems with faulty torpedoes had plagued the silent service, leading to frustration and missed opportunities. By 1943, however, those issues had been largely corrected, and the U.S. submarine fleet became the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific. Their targets were not only warships, but also the merchant convoys and oil tankers that fed Japan's war machine. By June 1944, Japanese industry and fleet operations were already strangled by these attacks, as submarines cut off fuel supplies from the Dutch East Indies. In the Philippine Sea, the submarines added another dimension. They were scouts in the vanguard of Task Force 58. Operating far ahead of the carrier groups, they monitored Japanese movements and reported them with precision. The combination of stealth, endurance, and striking power gave the Americans a crucial advantage. Submarines would not just watch the enemy in this battle, they would strike directly at its heart. Among the submarines prowling the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was USS Albacore, SS-218, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James W. Blanchard. Positioned along the expected Japanese approach route, Albacore detected the carrier force as it steamed west of the Marianas. On the morning of June 19th, Blanchard maneuvered into position and prepared for an attack. His periscope revealed the imposing silhouette of the carrier Tai, Ozawa's flagship and Japan's newest pride. With nerves of steel, Blanchard fired a spread of torpedoes at the giant carrier. One struck home, exploding beneath Taiha's armored hull. At first, damage appeared limited, but fumes and gasoline vapors spread throughout the ship. Hours later, a catastrophic internal explosion would rip Taiha apart, sending Japan's most advanced carrier to the bottom. Albacore's single torpedo had changed the course of the battle. Submarines in the shadows had struck a blow no carrier air group could have planned more effectively. Another submarine, USS Kavala, SS-244, added to the devastation later that same day. Commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, Kavala had trailed the Japanese carrier Shokaku, one of the proud veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. Moving stealthily beneath the waves, Kostler closed to attack range as Shokaku's flight deck bustled with operations. At 11:22 a.m., Kavala launched 6 torpedoes, 3 of which slammed into the carrier's hull with devastating effect. Explosions tore through the hangar deck, igniting fuel and munitions in a chain reaction. The mighty Shokaku, survivor of so many battles, was engulfed in fire and sank within hours. Kavala's crew had delivered a death blow to one of Japan's most storied ships. The sinking was not only a tactical victory, but a symbolic one, erasing another veteran of Japan's once mighty carrier fleet. The silent service had spoken with thunder. The success of Albacore and Kavala highlighted the unique strengths of submarines in naval warfare. Unlike surface ships, they could strike unseen, slipping through screens of destroyers and cruisers to attack at close range. Their presence forced the Japanese to divert escorts and conduct evasive maneuvers, disrupting formations and reducing the efficiency of fleet operations. Ozawa's carriers, already weakened by inexperienced air groups, now had to contend with the invisible menace lurking below. Each attack not only inflicted damage, but also sowed psychological fear. Japanese sailors knew that beneath the calm blue surface could lurk a predator waiting to strike without warning. This constant pressure strained morale and complicated command decisions. Submarines thus multiplied their effect, combining physical destruction with psychological warfare. They were predators in every sense of the word. The shadows beneath the sea belonged to them. Intelligence gathered by submarines before and during the battle was equally critical. Reports from submarines like Finback, Flying Fish, and Seahorse tracked Japanese fleet movements as they advanced toward the Philippine Sea. These sightings gave Spruance and Mitchell the clarity they needed to position Task Force 58 effectively. In a battle where distance and timing were everything, such intelligence often meant the difference between readiness and surprise. Submarine reconnaissance also provided early warnings of Japanese sortie routes, confirming code-breaker assessments and ensuring that no major movement went undetected. The silent service acted as scouts for the carrier groups, expanding their situational awareness beyond the horizon. Without submarines, the Americans might have faced the Japanese fleet blind, forced into reaction rather than preparation. Instead, they met their enemy with foreknowledge and confidence. Information was power, and submarines provided it in abundance. For the men who served aboard these submarines, life was a constant test of endurance. Cramped into steel tubes, they endured stifling heat, recycled air, and the omnipresent stench of oil and machinery. When on patrol near the Japanese fleet, every sound carried the threat of discovery. Depth charges rained down when escorts caught a glimpse of a periscope, shaking the hull and threatening to crush the boat. Yet the crews persevered, driven by a sense of mission and the knowledge that their actions could change the course of the war. They lived in shadows, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and refresh air. For them, the Philippine Sea was not a grand panorama of carriers and battleships, but a tense, claustrophobic duel beneath the waves. Their victories came silently, marked not by cheers but by the muffled roar of an explosion heard through steel walls. They fought unseen, but their impact echoed across oceans. The contributions of the U.S. submarine force to the Battle of the Philippine Sea cannot be overstated. While carriers launched great waves of planes and battleships hurled massive shells, it was the submarines that delivered the first crippling blows to Ozawa's fleet. The sinking of Taiho and Shokaku reduced Japanese carrier strength at a stroke, erasing the pride of the Imperial Navy before the air battles even reached their climax. Intelligence provided by other submarines ensured that the Americans fought with knowledge rather than uncertainty. In the shadows of the Pacific, these steel hunters had shifted the balance of the battle. They proved that war was not only fought in the skies or on the surface, but also in the depths where silence and patience reigned. The Philippine Sea was a carrier battle, but it was also a submarine victory. Beneath the waves, America's silent service struck with deadly precision. The shadows had their own heroes, and their work would echo in history. The dawn of June 18, 1944, rose over the Philippine Sea with a deceptive calm, the sun glinting off endless waters that hid two massive fleets closing in on one another. To the east steamed Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitcher's mighty carrier strike force, a floating armada whose power stretched horizon to horizon. To the west lurked Admiral Gisibert Ozawa's mobile fleet, battered in spirit yet still formidable on paper, its carriers and battleships pressing eastward in search of a decisive encounter. Between them stretched hundreds of miles of open ocean, a battleground that would soon become the stage for one of the largest carrier battles in history. Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, maintained a cautious stance, wary of being lured into a trap by Japanese land-based aircraft. Ozawa, on the other hand, sought to close the distance, confident that his combined carrier and land-based forces could overwhelm the Americans. Both commanders understood the stakes, the fate of the Marianas, and with them the trajectory of the Pacific War. The stage was set for a clash of titans. On board the American carriers, preparations were already reaching fever pitch. Hellcat fighters sat fueled and armed on deck, their pilots briefed and ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Avenger, torpedo bombers, and Helldiver dive bombers were positioned in their hangars, mechanics working tirelessly to ensure every machine was combat ready. Radar screens flickered in the operations rooms, sweeping the skies and seas for the first hint of enemy movement. In ready rooms, pilots studied maps and practiced tactical maneuvers, the weight of expectation heavy on their shoulders. Sailors on the flight decks, sunburned and sweat-soaked, performed their duties with drilled precision, fueling, arming, and inspecting the planes. Mitcher's task groups moved in calculated formation, carriers flanked by battleships and cruisers, destroyers patrolling the perimeters like watchdogs. The entire fleet bristled with readiness, an armada forged by industry and sharpened by experience. There was no doubt among the Americans the enemy would come, and when he did, they would be ready. The calm before the storm was taut with anticipation. For the Japanese, the approach into the Philippine Sea was marked by tension and uncertainty. Ozawa's fleet advanced eastward, its carriers carrying aircraft crews who were young, inexperienced, and yet eager for the honor of battle. The loss of Taiho and Shakaku earlier that day to submarine attacks had been a staggering blow, but Ozawa pressed on with what remained. His flagship was now the carrier Zakaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force, bearing the weight of history and expectation. Battleships like Yamato and Musashi steamed alongside, their massive guns largely irrelevant in an air-dominated war, but still symbols of Japan's defiance. Fuel shortages gnawed at every calculation, forcing Ozawa to sail with caution, yet his orders were clear: bring the Americans to battle at all costs. Morale was mixed. Junior pilots brimmed with fervor, while veterans carried silent dread. Beneath the banners of the rising sun, the mobile fleet sailed on. Ahead lay destiny, whether in triumph or annihilation. Admiral Spruance, commanding from the battleship Indianapolis, weighed his decisions with characteristic caution. Intelligence suggested that Ozawa's fleet was approaching, but its exact location remained uncertain. Submarine reports confirmed movements, yet the vast distances of the Pacific left gaps in knowledge. Spruance's priority was the protection of the invasion forces at Saipan, where Marines were locked in ferocious combat against entrenched Japanese defenders. He feared that a reckless pursuit of Ozawa might expose the transports and ground forces to a counterstrike. Mitcher, by contrast, advocated for a more aggressive stance, eager to unleash Task Force 58 against the Japanese carriers. The debate between caution and boldness reflected the dual pressures of responsibility and opportunity. Spruance chose patience, preferring to let Ozawa come to him rather than risk overextension. This decision would shape the rhythm of the coming battle. The Americans, though poised for attack, waited with steel nerves for the enemy's move. Meanwhile, the skies above the Philippine Sea filled with reconnaissance aircraft, the eyes of both fleets searching for the other. American Avengers flew long patrol arcs, guided by radar and intelligence, sweeping the sea for signs of the Japanese. Japanese scouts launched from carriers and island airstrips, their pilots tasked with locating the American fleet and reporting its position. The vastness of the Pacific made these searches a game of endurance and luck, where a single sighting could determine the fate of thousands. On June 18th, both sides sent out dozens of reconnaissance planes, probing the horizon, dodging storms, and risking interception. For hours the reports were fragmentary and uncertain, dots of information on a vast map of ocean. Both commanders knew that accurate scouting was the key to striking first. In carrier warfare, the side that launched the opening blow often carried the advantage. Every passing minute was filled with tension. Every message received a potential harbinger of battle. The Japanese placed great faith in their land-based air groups stationed on Guam and other islands, but these forces were already badly depleted by American raids. On the evening of June 18th, Ozawa prepared to coordinate his carriers with what remained of these land-based squadrons. Yet the reality was grim. Many of the planes had been destroyed on the ground, while surviving pilots lacked experience. Still, Tokyo demanded that these units be thrown into the fight, regardless of readiness. The idea was to combine waves of carrier and land-based aircraft in overwhelming attacks, crushing the American fleet under sheer numbers. But American radar and Hellcats stood ready, eager to intercept. Unknown to Ozawa, his reliance on these fragile squadrons was a fatal flaw. The Japanese believed they could replicate the surprise and devastation of Pearl Harbor. Instead, they were about to unleash chaos and slaughter upon their own young flyers. The stage was set for disaster, masked as hope. As the sun set on June 18th, the fleets drew closer, separated by little more than 300 miles of ocean. Aboard the American carriers, night operations continued with radar sweeps, combat air patrols, and endless drills. Sailors spoke in hushed tones, aware that the next day could bring history's greatest aerial battle. In the Japanese fleet, tension gave way to ritual, with many young pilots writing farewell notes or performing final prayers. Some officers reminded them that survival was unlikely, framing the battle as a chance to sacrifice for the emperor and the empire. Engines rumbled in the darkness as ships steamed ahead, their wakes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The silence of the night belied the storm that was about to erupt. Both fleets were now within striking distance, their fates intertwined by the coming dawn. June 19th would decide the future of the Pacific. The shadows of war pressed closer, and the sea waited. Thus, by the close of June 18, 1944, the Philippine Sea had become a vast stage upon which the final act of Japanese carrier power was about to be performed. Task Force 58 bristled with strength, its carriers loaded with planes, its crews disciplined and ready, its radar scanning the skies. Ozawa's fleet pressed forward, battered by submarine losses yet determined to fight, its young aviators carrying courage but little skill. Between them lay not only the waters of the Pacific, but the destiny of nations. The Americans sought to secure the Marianas and open the door to Japan's heartland. The Japanese sought one last decisive blow to stave off defeat and reclaim honor. Both sides knew that tomorrow would bring carnage on an unprecedented scale. The ocean was quiet, but it was the quiet of anticipation, the calm before the fury of engines, bombs, and fire. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was hours away. The stage was set, and history waited to be written. The morning of June 19, 1944, dawned bright and clear over the Philippine Sea, a sky of blue stretching above the silent tension of two converging fleets. On board Admiral Ozawa's carriers, young Japanese pilots scrambled to their aircraft, preparing for the great strike that would decide the fate of the Marianas. Their orders were simple yet monumental: find the American fleet, destroy its carriers, and restore the balance of the Pacific. On Zurikaku and her sister ships, deck crews rushed to fuel and arm the fragile Zeros, Judys, and Jills, their engines roaring to life with the smell of aviation fuel heavy in the air. For many of these pilots, this would be their first combat mission, and for most it would be their last. At 8:30 a.m., the first wave of 69 planes lifted into the sky, circling into formation before heading eastward toward Task Force 58. Additional waves were scheduled to follow, each intended to hammer the Americans in relentless succession. Ozawa hoped that sheer numbers would overcome inexperience. The morning sun bore witness to a gamble steeped in desperation. Aboard Task Force 58, the Americans were not caught off guard. Radar operators, hunched over glowing screens, detected the first Japanese formations long before they came into visual range. Blips appeared at distances of over 150 miles, allowing Mitcher and his commanders ample time to react. Orders crackled through the radios. Fighters were scrambled, combat air patrols vectored to intercept, and carriers prepared for possible strikes. By 10 a.m., Hellcats were already climbing to altitude, engines thundering as pilots positioned themselves between the Japanese attackers and the fleet below. The beauty of radar lay not only in detection but in direction. American controllers guided squadrons with pinpoint accuracy, ensuring that the intercept would be perfectly timed on flight decks. Sailors watched anxiously as their comrades disappeared into the sky. Below decks, gun crews manned anti-aircraft stations, ready for action should any enemy slip through. The Americans were not waiting to be struck. They were waiting to strike first. The first clash came high above the Philippine Sea, where Japanese formations flying in loose, poorly coordinated groups suddenly found themselves swarmed by disciplined waves of Hellcats. The Americans, faster and more heavily armed, pounced with devastating efficiency. Machine guns roared, tracers arcing through the sky as Japanese planes disintegrated in mid-air, wings tearing free, or engines bursting into flame. In minutes the formation dissolved into chaos, bombers dropping out of formation, while Zeros tried in vain to shield them. But the Japanese pilots lacked the training to execute coordinated defense, and their maneuvers only made them easier targets. American pilots, many veterans of earlier campaigns, pressed their advantage ruthlessly. Kill after kill fell into their laps, the Hellcats' firepower shredding fragile Japanese machines. Survivors fled or plunged into the sea, their mission aborted before even reaching the American fleet. The battle was not an even duel, it was an extermination. The legend of the great Marianas Turkey Shoot was born in these opening encounters. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft attempted to break through, but each met the same fate. Radar guided the Hellcats into position long before the bombers drew near, ensuring that few attackers ever closed within range of the carriers. By midday, nearly 200 Japanese planes had been launched from Ozawa's fleet, with additional support trickling in from land-based airfields on Guam. The Americans intercepted them all, turning the skies into a slaughterhouse of steel and flame. Hellcats dove from above, while others engaged head-on, filling the air with deadly crisscrossing fire. Anti-aircraft batteries thundered from the ships below, filling the horizon with black bursts of flak that trapped any Japanese aircraft lucky enough to slip past the fighters. The coordination was seamless, radar, fighters, and gunners working in perfect unison. Japanese pilots pressed on with courage, but courage alone could not penetrate such defenses. One by one, their planes were cut from the sky. The Americans were writing a massacre into history. For the Japanese aviators, the morning was a nightmare unfolding at impossible speed. Young men who had dreamed of glory found themselves outmatched, outgunned, and slaughtered before their weapons could be loosed. Bombers carrying torpedoes never reached launch distance. Dive bombers never sighted the carriers they were meant to strike. Communication broke down under pressure, formations scattered, and confusion reigned. Many pilots had barely any training in long-distance navigation and became lost, never finding the American fleet at all. Others, damaged or disoriented, ditched into the sea long before completing their missions. Veterans who had once struck fear into their enemies now looked down in horror at the spectacle of annihilation unfolding around them. The great blow that was supposed to cripple Task Force 58 never materialized. Instead, it was the Japanese who were crippled, bleeding strength in the very first hours of battle. The Philippine Sea was claiming Japan's air arm in broad daylight. For American pilots, the morning was remembered not as a contest, but as a harvest. The Hellcats proved themselves nearly invincible, their armor absorbing hits that would have destroyed Zeros, their guns dispatching enemies with ruthless efficiency. Pilots reported shooting down 3, 4, even 5 aircraft in a single sortie. Some squadrons returned with barely a scratch, their kill tallies climbing into the dozens. The phrase "Turkey Shoot" spread quickly, coined by a pilot who compared the one-sided battle to the ease of hunting tame birds. Yet behind the humor lay grim reality. The skies were littered with burning wreckage, parachutes trailing into the sea, and young Japanese lives extinguished in moments. For the Americans, the overwhelming victory was exhilarating but sobering, a reminder of the terrible imbalance of the war. They knew they had achieved near total dominance of the air. The morning belonged to the Hellcats, and with them the US Navy. By noon, the scale of the disaster for Japan had become clear. Of the hundreds of aircraft launched that morning, more than two-thirds had been destroyed. Only a handful reached within striking distance of the American fleet, and even these inflicted minimal damage. A single bomb scored a near miss on the battleship South Dakota, causing casualties but not impairing the ship's fighting ability. For a fleet that had gambled everything on its air power, the results were catastrophic. Ozawa's carriers, their decks emptied of planes, were suddenly reduced to helpless hulks, unable to strike back. The American fleet, by contrast, remained virtually untouched, its strength undiminished. The imbalance was now irreversible, and the Japanese command knew it, but the battle was far from over. Ozawa still had more waves to launch, and the Americans still had yet to unleash their own counterblows. The Philippine Sea had only begun to reveal its fury. The morning of June 19th marked a turning point not only in the battle, but in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese Navy had once dominated the skies with its superb pilots and agile aircraft, but those days were gone. Now its air groups were shattered against the wall of American technology, discipline, and training. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot became a symbol of this transformation, a battle where skill and preparation utterly eclipsed courage and tradition. For the Americans, it was validation of their industrial might and tactical innovation. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of the end, a bleeding away of their last reserves of air power. The Philippine Sea had claimed its first great victims, and the day was far from over. Ahead lay more waves, more losses, and the looming possibility of American counterstrikes. But by the close of the morning, one truth was inescapable. Japan's naval aviation was broken. The skies no longer belonged to the rising sun. The morning strikes had ended in disaster for Japan, yet Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was not ready to concede defeat. Believing that persistence might wear down the Americans, he ordered additional waves of aircraft into the skies above the Philippine Sea. By midday, more than 300 planes had been dispatched from his carriers, reinforced by whatever remnants could be scraped together from Guam's battered airfields. The plan was to sustain pressure, launching successive waves to exhaust American fighters and saturate their defenses. On the Japanese flight decks, nervous crews refueled and re-engined planes with desperate haste, as young aviators climbed back into cockpits despite knowing the fate that awaited them. Many pilots launched already fatigued, having flown earlier sorties and barely survived. Their resolve was strong, but their skill and coordination remained fatally lacking. Ozawa hoped that weight of numbers might yet crack Task Force 58's shield, but the Americans were ready, and the shield was unbreakable. Radar once again proved decisive for the Americans as the second wave of Japanese aircraft climbed toward the fleet. Screens aboard carriers and cruisers lit up with distant echoes, giving Mitcher and his commanders more than an hour's warning. Combat air patrols, already aloft, were vectored directly toward the incoming formations. Additional Hellcats scrambled from the carriers, engines screaming as they raced to intercept. The Japanese approached in loose, disorganized groups, their navigational skills poor and their formations riddled with gaps. In contrast, the Americans fought in disciplined pairs and squadrons, each pilot covering his wingman, each maneuver calculated. The clash unfolded high above the waves, where Hellcats fell upon Judies and Jills like hawks on doves. Bombers tumbled from the sky in flames. Their missions ended before their targets were even sighted. Only a fraction pressed forward, battered remnants of formations that had begun full of hope. Radar had once again handed the Americans the initiative, and they wielded it with merciless precision. For the Japanese bombers that did slip through the gauntlet, another layer of defense awaited the thunder of American anti-aircraft guns. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed storms of fire. Their 5-inch dual-purpose guns and 40 mm Bofors creating dense walls of steel and flak. Shell bursts filled the skies with black smoke, jagged fragments tearing into fragile aircraft. Gunners, drilled endlessly, tracked targets with radar-directed precision, adjusting with deadly accuracy as planes closed in. Many Japanese pilots, flying low in desperate attempts to avoid interception, were shredded by curtains of fire before they could line up their runs. Bombs fell wide, torpedoes splashed harmlessly into the sea, and the few near misses inflicted no serious harm. The spectacle was terrifying for both sides, attackers flying into certain death, defenders unleashing torrents of fire that shook ships from stem to stern. To American crews, the barrages were reassurance. To Japanese pilots, they were an impenetrable wall. The closer they flew, the closer they came to annihilation. Despite catastrophic losses, Ozawa pressed his flyers into repeated assaults throughout the day. By early afternoon, a third wave of nearly 100 aircraft rose from his surviving carriers and land bases, straining to reach the Americans. Again, radar spotted them far out, and again the Hellcats surged into the skies. These young Japanese pilots, many already exhausted and terrified, found themselves intercepted long before reaching their targets. Some never even realized where the American carriers were before being shot down. Others tried to press on, only to be swarmed and destroyed in merciless efficiency. The Americans, confident and experienced, treated each wave as another drill, honing their skills while racking up staggering kill counts. Entire squadrons of Japanese aircraft disappeared within minutes, their missions erased almost as soon as they began. To Ozawa, the losses were unsustainable, but retreat was unthinkable. Japan's gamble demanded sacrifice, and his aviators were paying the price in blood and fire. By mid-afternoon, the air over the Philippine Sea had become a graveyard of wreckage. Burning aircraft spiraled into the ocean, leaving oily streaks and scattered debris. Survivors clung to rafts or swam in vain, while destroyers searched unsuccessfully for downed comrades. The Americans, still largely untouched, cycled their squadrons with remarkable efficiency, refueling, rearming, and relaunching planes in tight sequences. Deck crews worked tirelessly, drenched in sweat, hauling bombs and ammunition, even as spent brass clattered across the decks. Hellcats returned with bullet holes and scorch marks, but seldom failed to bring their pilots home. Reports filtered through the fleet of astonishing kill ratios, sometimes 20 or 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every one American lost. The lopsidedness was staggering, a testament not only to superior technology, but to a system that valued training and survival over expendability. Japanese pilots fought with courage, but courage could not equal preparation. The Philippine Sea was devouring their air arm wave by wave. The failure of coordination between carrier-based and land-based Japanese aircraft further doomed their efforts. Ozawa's grand plan had been to merge his carrier strikes with squadrons from Guam and Tinian, overwhelming the Americans through massed assault. In reality, communications were poor, radios unreliable, and navigation skills inadequate. Land-based pilots launched late, often arriving hours after their carrier counterparts had already been annihilated. Some formations never found the American fleet at all, wandering over open ocean until fuel ran dry. Others were intercepted and destroyed piecemeal by combat air patrols before ever linking up with Ozawa's waves. Instead of a hammer blow, the Japanese presented their enemy with a series of scattered strikes, each weaker than the last. The Americans faced not a storm but a drizzle, and they swatted it aside with ease. The grand vision of a decisive battle collapsed into chaos. The skies bore witness to Japan's unraveling. For the Americans, the sheer scale of the aerial slaughter was almost surreal. Pilots returned to their carriers, reporting kill counts so high they seemed unbelievable. Commanders cross-checked and confirmed, realizing that the Japanese Navy was being bled white in a single day. Morale surged through Task Force 58, not with arrogance but with the quiet recognition that they had achieved air supremacy beyond question. Yet the pilots and sailors also understood the grim reality of what they were witnessing. Each Japanese plane destroyed represented a young man lost, another life expended in a futile gamble. The phrase "turkey shoot," though apt in its simplicity, belied the human tragedy unfolding in the skies. American aviators felt both exhilaration and unease, aware that they were part of history's most one-sided aerial battle. The outcome was certain, but the cost in human lives was staggering. The Philippine Sea was becoming not just a battlefield but a graveyard. As June 19th drew toward evening, the toll on the Japanese became unmistakable. Nearly 350 aircraft had been lost in a single day, while American losses barely reached double digits. Ozawa's once proud mobile fleet, envisioned as the hammer of Operation Ago, had been stripped of its striking power before it could land a serious blow. His carriers still floated, but their decks were empty, their hangars hollow. The Americans, meanwhile, remained fully capable, their carriers ready to launch their own strikes when the time came. The contrast could not have been sharper, one fleet bleeding itself dry in futile assaults, the other waiting, watchful and strong. June 19th had revealed the reality of modern naval warfare. Technology, training, and organization could overwhelm tradition and spirit. For Japan, the day was a disaster beyond recovery. For the United States, it was a triumph of preparation and power. The first day of the Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended in decisive dominance, and yet the battle was not finished. While American fighters dominated the skies on June 19th, silent hunters prowling beneath the Philippine Sea prepared to deliver their own deadly blows. Among them was USS Albacore, SS-218, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James W. Blanchard, stationed along the projected route of Ozawa's advancing fleet. At dawn, her sonar operators strained to pick up the faint sounds of screws, while her periscope swept the horizon for shadows against the vast expanse of water. Then the moment came. The unmistakable silhouette of the Japanese supercarrier Taiho emerged in the lens. This was no ordinary target. Taiho was Japan's newest, most advanced carrier, launched only months earlier, boasting an armored flight deck meant to survive where others had failed. She was the pride of the fleet, Ozawa's flagship, and the vessel upon which Japan pinned its hopes. Blanchard knew the opportunity before him was immense. At 9 a.m., he ordered his crew to set up an attack run. The fate of one of Japan's last great carriers hung in the balance. With steady nerves, Blanchard lined up Albacore for a firing solution, calculating range, speed, and bearing under immense pressure. He ordered a spread of 6 torpedoes fired at the massive target, white trails slicing through the deep blue waters toward Taiho. The Japanese lookout spotted the wakes and shouted warnings, and the carrier began evasive maneuvers. Destroyers rushed forward to intercept, dropping depth charges in an effort to kill the attacker. One torpedo was diverted by quick action, another exploded prematurely, a bitter reminder of earlier torpedo reliability issues. But one found its mark, slamming into Tai Ho's hull on the starboard side, beneath the armored deck. The explosion ripped open compartments and ruptured fuel tanks, filling the ship with fumes of aviation gasoline. At first, damage control parties believed the carrier had survived, her armor shielding her from the worst. Ozawa, still aboard, reassured his staff that Tai Ho could continue operations. Yet below decks, invisible death spread, vapors seeping into every corridor, turning the ship into a floating time bomb. On board Tai Ho, chaos slowly unfolded as the hours passed. The crew, inexperienced in modern carrier damage control, failed to properly ventilate the gasoline fumes spreading through the ship. Instead of carefully venting and isolating compartments, they operated pumps and fans that circulated the vapors further. The stench of fuel became overwhelming, creeping into living spaces, machinery rooms, and even the flight deck. Sailors gagged as the invisible cloud thickened, unaware that the entire ship was becoming a powder keg. Despite these problems, flight operations continued, with aircraft launching and landing in a futile attempt to maintain combat effectiveness. Ozawa refused to abandon his flagship, still confident that Tai Ho could survive. But by early afternoon, the fumes reached critical levels. At 2:30 p.m., a spark, perhaps from an electric motor, perhaps from careless handling, ignited the vapors. A colossal explosion ripped through the carrier, splitting her decks, engulfing her in fire, and sending her into the depths. Japan's most modern carrier, symbol of its naval future, was gone within hours of her first battle. Not far away, another submarine prepared to make history. U.S. Cavalier SS-244, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, had slipped into position, shadowing the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku. Shokaku was no ordinary ship. She was one of the veterans of Pearl Harbor, part of the force that had brought devastation to the U.S. Pacific Fleet in December 1941. She had fought at Coral Sea and survived Midway, her decks scarred but her spirit unbroken. To the Americans, sinking her would be an act of justice, a symbolic blow that avenged years of Japanese triumphs. On June 19th, fate handed Kostler the chance. As Shokaku maneuvered to recover aircraft from Ozawa's shattered strikes, Cavalier tracked her movements with relentless patience. Kostler ordered his crew to close the gap, preparing his torpedoes for the kill. Through the periscope, the great carrier loomed, a target of history itself. At 11:22 a.m., Cavalier launched 6 torpedoes, streaking silently through the water toward Shokaku. The Japanese carrier's lookout spotted them too late, and evasive maneuvers came only seconds before impact. 3 torpedoes slammed into her port side, tearing open massive holes in her hull. Explosions ripped through the hangar deck, where fueled and armed aircraft turned into raging fireballs. Ammunition cooked off, sending shock waves throughout the ship. Smoke billowed skyward as flames consumed everything in their path. The crew fought desperately to contain the inferno, but the damage was beyond repair. At 2 p.m., Shokaku capsized and sank beneath the waves, taking over 1,200 officers and sailors with her. The once proud carrier, a symbol of Japan's naval might, was gone forever. Cavalier had claimed a giant, and with it another piece of Japan's dwindling carrier force. The near-simultaneous destruction of Tai Ho and Shokaku was a catastrophe from which Ozawa's fleet could not recover. 2 of his largest, most capable carriers had been lost within hours, struck not by planes but by unseen predators lurking beneath the sea. The loss of Tai Ho was particularly devastating, as she had been intended to represent Japan's adaptation to armored flight decks and modern carrier design. Shokaku's sinking carried symbolic weight, erasing a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea in the very waters where Japan had hoped to regain momentum. Ozawa, forced to transfer his flag to the light carrier Zuikaku, now commanded a fleet stripped of much of its offensive potential. Worse still, the destruction of these carriers meant the loss of hundreds of trained crew members, mechanics, and precious equipment that could never be replaced. Submarines had once again proven their disproportionate power. The silent service had turned the tide of battle from below. For the Americans, news of the sinkings was met with jubilation tempered by respect. On the carriers of Task Force 58, sailors cheered when reports arrived that Shokaku and Taiho had been struck down. Pilots who had faced those very decks in earlier campaigns recognized the magnitude of the victory. Submarine crews, often overshadowed by the glory of carrier aviators, now claimed their place in the spotlight. Yet the men of Albacore and Kavala knew the price of their work: long hours in cramped, airless compartments, constant fear of depth charges, and the nerve-wracking patience required to stalk a target. Their success was a testament not only to skill, but to endurance. They had delivered the kind of blows that airstrikes alone could not have guaranteed. Submarines, silent and unseen, had reshaped the course of the battle. The Philippine Sea was becoming a graveyard of Japanese carriers, and much of the credit lay beneath the waves. By the end of June 19, 1944, the Japanese mobile fleet was crippled beyond repair. The skies had claimed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, and now the seas had claimed two of its proudest carriers. Ozawa's striking power was gutted, his fleet reduced to shells of ships with empty decks and broken hearts. The loss of Taiho and Shokaku underscored Japan's fatal imbalance. Modern designs and proud traditions could not compensate for inexperience, poor coordination, and the relentless efficiency of American technology and tactics. For the United States, the day was a demonstration of total dominance across every domain: air, surface, and undersea. Submarines had delivered the coup de grace, erasing Japan's hopes of a decisive counterblow. The battle was far from finished, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Philippine Sea had revealed the futility of Japan's gamble. Beneath its blue waters lay the wreckage of ships, the sacrifice of men, and the verdict of history. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea fell into a tense and uneasy calm, its vast waters concealing fleets that had battered one another from dawn until dusk. For the Japanese, the day had been catastrophic. Hundreds of planes lost, two of their most prized carriers sunk, and the remnants of their air arms scattered or broken. Admiral Ozawa, now commanding from the Zuikaku, was left with a fleet that looked formidable on paper, but was hollow in reality, its decks stripped bare of aircraft. Yet he did not immediately retreat. Instead, he gathered his surviving ships into tighter formation, hoping to preserve cohesion while awaiting further orders from Tokyo. For the Americans, the situation seemed equally decisive, but Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the battleship Indianapolis wrestled with uncertainty. Reports confirmed staggering Japanese losses, yet the true scale of their retreat and the state of their carriers remained unclear. Spruance's foremost concern was not glory, but the safety of the Saipan invasion force, which remained vulnerable if he overextended. Nightfall brought with it more questions than answers. The day's victory was undeniable, but its next chapter was not yet written. Aboard Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitcher and his carrier commanders were eager to press the attack. They argued that the Japanese fleet was reeling, its carriers crippled, its pilots slaughtered, and that pursuit might yield a decisive destruction of Japan's naval air power once and for all. Mitcher, A fighting admiral by nature, saw the opportunity as golden, a chance to replicate the crushing victory of Midway on an even larger scale. Yet he was bound by Spruance's authority, for the Fifth Fleet's overall command rested in the cautious, methodical hands of the admiral known as Old Stone Face. Spruance's cautious instincts were shaped not by timidity, but by strategic responsibility. His mission was to cover the invasion of Saipan, not to gamble the fleet on a chase across the Philippine Sea. If Ozawa had baited him eastward, Japanese land-based aircraft from the Marianas might yet pounce upon the unguarded transports. The debate simmered through the evening, one side calling for boldness, the other for prudence. It was a clash of philosophies as much as strategy. Both men understood that history might judge them harshly, whichever path they chose. On the Japanese side, the atmosphere was one of grim desperation, mixed with false hope. Ozawa relayed messages to Tokyo claiming that his fleet was still in the fight, emphasizing the damage supposedly inflicted upon American carriers. Japanese staff officers clung to exaggerated reports from their surviving pilots, many of whom claimed successes that never occurred. They believed they had struck multiple carriers and inflicted heavy damage, a narrative far removed from the brutal reality of annihilation. Yet within Ozawa's flagship, the truth could not be hidden. Decks were nearly empty, hangars eerily quiet, and the proud Mobile fleet reduced to a shell of its intended power. Officers whispered doubts, while sailors counted the missing squadrons and realized they would not return. The loss of Taiho and Shukaku was particularly crushing, their absence leaving gaping holes in the heart of the fleet. Still, Ozawa resolved to regroup and fight another day, for retreat without orders would dishonor the fleet. The night cloaked the Japanese ships, but it could not hide their wounds. Throughout Task Force 58, tension persisted, even amid celebration. Pilots returned from the day's battles with tales of astonishing kill counts, but as the fleet steamed westward, crews wondered whether the Japanese might launch a desperate night attack. Combat air patrols were reduced in the darkness, radar screens remained crowded with echoes, and the threat of shadowing enemy submarines loomed large. Carriers adjusted their formations, destroyers tightened their patrols, and sailors manned guns through the night with weary vigilance. Mitcher, though eager for pursuit, knew the perils of night carrier operations, for even the most skilled pilots risked disaster landing on darkened decks. In a war where aircraft were precious, losing them to the sea in the dark could undermine the day's triumph. Thus, despite confidence, the Americans shared their own unease. The silence of the Philippine Sea was deceptive, masking the possibility of ambush. Both fleets felt the weight of the unknown pressing down as the night deepened. Spruance convened his staff to deliberate on the options, listening as voices urged both restraint and aggression. Intelligence reports suggested that Japanese carriers were retreating westward, but the fog of war meant their exact positions were uncertain. A bold thrust might close the gap and finish them off, yet it might also stretch the fleet into perilous waters closer to Japanese bases. To Spruance, the protection of Saipan outweighed all else. The island was the linchpin of the American campaign in the Marianas, and its fall would bring Japan within range of American B-29 bombers. Risking the transports for the possibility of annihilating Ozawa's carriers was a gamble he would not take. Mitcher pressed his case for aggression but ultimately deferred to Spruance's judgment, for chain of command was sacrosanct in the U.S. Navy. The fleet maintained a measured course, balancing readiness for renewed combat with the overarching mission of safeguarding the invasion. Prudence, not daring, guided the hand of the Fifth Fleet that night. Spruance's decision would echo through history as one of the most debated choices of the Pacific War. For the men in the ranks, the night brought exhaustion as well as anticipation. On flight decks, crews rested beside their planes, catching what little sleep they could, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Gunners remained at their stations, scanning the dark horizon where danger might emerge. In the mess halls, sailors whispered about the day's victories, marveling at the sheer number of enemy aircraft destroyed. Others worried about what the Japanese might attempt next, recalling the kamikaze-like desperation of some pilots who had pressed home attacks despite impossible odds. Below decks, engines rumbled steadily, the heartbeat of the great fleet pushing it westward into uncertainty. In their bunks, young men clutched letters from home, thinking of families far away, even as they prepared to fight again at dawn. War was both grand strategy and intimate human struggle, and the night of June 19th embodied both. For every admiral's decision, thousands of sailors bore the weight. The hours passed slowly, each one heavy with expectation. In Ozawa's fleet, the night was no less grim. Survivors from downed squadrons floated in the water, clinging to rafts or wreckage, their fates unknown as the darkness swallowed them. On his carriers, officers debated how many aircraft could realistically be launched the next day, but the numbers were pitiful. Some ships had fewer than a dozen planes left operational, their decks once crowded, now eerily empty. The proud Japanese carrier arm, once the terror of the Pacific, had been hollowed out in a single day. And yet Ozawa's crews clung to discipline, maintaining formations, repairing what damage they could, and preparing for whatever orders would come. The admiral himself masked his despair, projecting calm resolve even as he understood the true magnitude of the disaster. For many sailors, the knowledge was unavoidable. The battle was already lost, even if the fleet still floated. The night gave them no reprieve, only a veil over their looming defeat. The mobile fleet was adrift in uncertainty, its future dark as the waters around it. Thus, the night of June 19th closed upon both fleets in different shades of uncertainty. For the Americans, it was a night of opportunity restrained, a moment when victory might have been total but prudence held the fleet back. For the Japanese, it was a night of despair hidden beneath official communiques, a silence that concealed the collapse of their carrier air power. Both admirals, Prudence cautious, Ozawa desperate, carried the burden of choices that would shape the war's next phase. The Philippine Sea, calm and vast, bore silent witness to their decisions, its dark surface reflecting the glow of ships steaming into the unknown. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly, but the final act had not yet been played. Dawn would bring clarity, action, and consequences. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not yet finished. Its second day awaited. In the stillness of night, history held its breath. The morning of June 20th, 1944, began with a strange mix of triumph and frustration for the Americans. The previous day's slaughter of Japanese air power had secured Task Force 58's safety and preserved the Saipan invasion force. Yet the Japanese fleet still floated somewhere to the west, retreating towards safety, yet not entirely beyond reach. Admiral Raymond Spruance, cautious as ever, remained focused on protecting the transports and declined to chase recklessly after Ozawa. But Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the carriers, was restless. He believed that one final blow could transform victory into annihilation, breaking the Japanese carrier fleet forever. Scouts were launched at dawn to locate the enemy, fanning out in wide arcs across the Philippine Sea. Hours passed with no confirmed sightings, the vastness of the ocean swallowing clues. Then at mid-afternoon came the breakthrough. Scout planes reported contacts 275 miles to the west. The Japanese had been found, and the moment of decision arrived. Mitcher faced a dilemma that tested both his nerve and his judgment. The enemy fleet lay far to the west, at the extreme edge of striking range for his aircraft. A late afternoon attack could damage or sink valuable Japanese carriers, but it would mean his pilots returning in total darkness, a nearly suicidal prospect for men accustomed to daylight landings. Night carrier operations were still rudimentary, fraught with risk even for the best-trained aviators. Mitscher weighed the odds in silence, his staff voicing arguments both for and against. To strike was to risk hundreds of aircraft and dozens of lives in the night sea. To hold back was to let the enemy slip away and preserve its remnants for another day. The balance hung on the razor's edge of opportunity and sacrifice. Mitscher, a man of action, made his choice. He ordered the strike. Shortly after 4 p.m., the decks of Task Force 58 erupted into a flurry of activity. Pilots strapped into their cockpits as crews rushed to fuel, arm, and launch wave after wave of planes. The strike force was massive. More than 200 aircraft, including Hellcats for escort, Helldivers for dive bombing, and Avengers carrying torpedoes. Engines roared as planes were taxied into position, the salty air thick with smoke and exhaust. Mitscher stood on his flagship's bridge, watching the squadrons rise into the sky, fully aware of the risk he was taking. Sailors on the flight decks waved their comrades off with hand signals and muted cheers, knowing many might not return. The sun was already sinking, its golden light casting long shadows across the carriers. The planes circled into formation, wings glittering in the fading light, before turning westward. The mission beyond darkness had begun, and fate now rode on their wings. The flight westward was long and grueling, each minute bringing the aviators closer to both their targets and the encroaching night. Beneath them stretched the vast emptiness of the Philippine Sea, a haunting reminder of how small even great fleets appeared in such waters. Radio chatter crackled as formations held course, escorts scanning the skies for possible interceptors, but the Japanese, depleted of planes, could not contest the approach. As the strike group closed in, the enemy fleet came into view, carriers, battleships, and cruisers steaming hard for safety. For the Americans, the sight was electrifying. Here were the ships that had launched so many attacks, now within reach of retribution. At 6:30 p.m., the first bombs and torpedoes fell from the sky. Explosions thundered across the sea, flames erupting from stricken Japanese vessels. The battle's final great clash had begun under a setting sun. The carrier Him became the primary victim of the onslaught. Avengers bore down upon her, torpedoes streaking through the water, while Helldivers plunged from above in steep dives. One torpedo struck amidships, and bombs tore through her flight deck, igniting fires that spread with terrifying speed. Gasoline tanks ruptured, fueling an inferno that consumed the ship. By nightfall, Himyo was sinking beneath the waves, her crew abandoning ship as flames licked the sky. Other Japanese carriers suffered as well, with Zuikaku and Junio narrowly avoiding catastrophic hits, but sustaining damage from near misses. Several cruisers and oilers were also struck, their decks aflame or machinery crippled. The strike force inflicted severe punishment in less than an hour of furious assault. For Ozawa it was another crushing blow, stripping his fleet of yet more carriers. For the Americans it was vindication of Mitscher's gamble. As the last bombs fell and torpedoes ran their courses, the American aviators turned eastward for the long flight home. But now the true peril of the mission became clear. The sun had set, and darkness engulfed the Philippine Sea, leaving only the stars and the faint glow of the horizon to guide them. Pilots strained their eyes, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, fuel gauges dropping dangerously low with each passing minute. Many realized they would reach the fleet after full dark, facing the near impossible task of landing on carriers without lights. Exhaustion pressed on them, nerves frayed by hours of combat and the looming danger of the sea. Radio transmissions grew frantic as pilots calculated their dwindling fuel. Some prepared themselves mentally for ditching into the water, hoping rescue destroyers might find them. The strike had succeeded, but survival was now uncertain. The true meaning of Mission Beyond Darkness revealed itself in the homeward flight. Back aboard Task Force 58, Admiral Mitcher confronted the consequences of his decision. He knew that unless drastic action was taken, many of his aviators would be lost to the sea. Against strict wartime protocol, he made a daring choice. He ordered every ship in the fleet to turn on its lights. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers illuminated the night, their decks glowing like floating cities, visible for miles in every direction. It was a beacon to guide his pilots home, but also a dangerous risk, for it revealed the fleet's position to any lurking enemy submarines. Yet Mitcher valued his men more than the safety of secrecy. One by one, the aircraft appeared out of the darkness, guided by the unexpected brilliance of the illuminated task force. The sea filled with the roar of engines as pilots attempted landings in the blackness, some successful, others crashing into the decks or ditching nearby. The fleet had become both sanctuary and graveyard. By midnight, most of the strike force had returned, though not without cost. Dozens of aircraft were lost to fuel exhaustion, crashes, or failed night landings, and many aviators perished in the sea, despite the valiant efforts of rescue destroyers. Yet the majority made it back, saved by Mitcher's extraordinary order to break blackout and risk everything for his men. The fleet steamed on through the night. Survivors plucked from the waters, wrecked planes pushed overboard to clear decks. The Japanese had suffered grievous losses, with Hyo sunk, other carriers damaged, and their retreat accelerated. The Americans had proven that boldness, tempered with compassion, could achieve both victory and loyalty. Mitcher's gamble became legend, a moment where leadership transcended calculation. The Mission Beyond Darkness entered history as one of the most daring carrier operations of the war. In the darkness of the Philippine Sea, courage had lit the way home. As the last American bombs fell in the fading light of June 20th, the Japanese carrier Hideo lay mortally wounded, smoke and fire pouring from her shattered hull. Torpedoes had ripped into her side, igniting aviation fuel that spread uncontrollably through the decks. Secondary explosions roared as ammunition magazines ignited, sending fireballs high into the twilight sky. Her crew fought desperately to contain the inferno, sealing compartments and spraying seawater, but the flames spread too quickly. By 7 p.m., Tho Sea, her fate was sealed, the order to abandon ship echoing across the decks. Sailors scrambled into the water, clinging to rafts as the carrier listed sharply. Minutes later, a massive internal blast ripped her apart, sealing her doom as she slipped beneath the waves. For the Americans, it was a victory, another Japanese carrier erased from the order of battle. But for the men in the skies, the battle was far from finished. Their greatest test still lay ahead. Other Japanese ships had not escaped unscathed. The carrier Zuikaku, Ozawa's flagship, suffered bomb damage that tore through her flight deck, though she remained afloat and operational. The light carrier Junio sustained damage from near misses that shattered her structure and reduced her speed. Several cruisers and oilers were hit as well, their decks scarred and engines crippled, slowing the fleet's retreat. The strikes had achieved their purpose, inflicting heavy losses and disrupting Japan's ability to regroup. Yet, as the Americans turned eastward, the sun slipped below the horizon, casting the vast ocean into darkness. Pilots looked down at their fuel gauges with mounting dread, realizing how little time remained before their tanks ran dry. Compass needles trembled, and radio chatter grew increasingly frantic. They had fought and won a battle in daylight, but now they faced the merciless challenge of survival in the dark. The Philippine Sea, unforgiving and vast, waited silently to claim them. On board the returning aircraft, the situation became critical as the last vestiges of daylight faded. Pilots strained to keep formation, using only the dim outlines of nearby planes against the starry sky. Navigation became guesswork, compasses and dead reckoning guiding squadrons back toward the fleet. Hundreds of miles away, fuel ran dangerously low, the needles dipping closer to empty as the miles ticked by. Some aircraft sputtered and fell into the sea before the fleet was even sighted, their crews vanishing into the night waves. Others pressed on, hoping for a miracle, clinging to the thought of seeing their carriers' decks lit against the black horizon. The silence of the ocean was broken only by engines, sputtering radios, and the occasional burst of static-laced communication. Every man knew he was flying against time itself. The battle was no longer against the Japanese, but against the dark. The return flight became a gauntlet more perilous than combat. On board Task Force 58, Admiral Mitscher understood the magnitude of the crisis unfolding in the skies. Without guidance, his aviators would never find their way back, and hundreds of planes could be lost to the sea. He made a decision both audacious and compassionate. He ordered the fleet to break blackout and illuminate the night. Against every rule of naval warfare, carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers switched on their running lights. Decks glowed with flood lamps, searchlights swept the horizon, and ships became glowing silhouettes against the Black Sea. It was a dangerous beacon, revealing their location to any Japanese submarines still lurking. But Mitscher valued the lives of his men above protocol, choosing humanity over safety. The fleet shone like a floating city in the darkness, a miraculous sight to the weary aviators searching for salvation. For the pilots, the sight was a lifeline, a promise that home was near. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic recoveries in naval history. As aircraft reached the fleet, chaos erupted on the flight decks. Planes circled in confused patterns, each pilot desperate to land before fuel gave out. Landing signals flashed frantically, guiding aircraft onto decks already crowded with wreckage and crash crews. Some pilots executed near-perfect landings despite exhaustion, their wheels screeching against the pitching decks. Others overshot or came in too fast, smashing into barriers or skidding into the sea beside their carriers. Fires broke out on several decks as planes crashed while still armed with bombs or torpedoes. Crewmen rushed into action, dousing flames, hauling pilots from burning cockpits, and shoving wrecks overboard to clear space for the next attempt. The roar of engines, the screams of men, and the clang of alarms filled the night. For every successful landing, another ended in tragedy. The recovery was a battle of endurance, fought not with guns but with skill, luck, and courage. Destroyers and smaller vessels joined the rescue effort, racing through the dark seas to pluck downed pilots from the water. Searchlights pierced the night as sailors threw life rings and hauled survivors aboard. Engines roared as ships maneuvered dangerously close to pick up airmen drifting in rafts or clinging to debris. Some men were saved within minutes of ditching, pulled from the waves cold, wet, but alive. Others vanished forever, swallowed by the Philippine Sea before help could arrive. The destroyers' crews risked their own safety, knowing that collisions, submarine threats, and enemy shadows were still possible. Yet their determination saved dozens of men who would otherwise have been lost. For the aviators who survived, the sight of a destroyer's light was as welcome as the dawn itself. The rescue effort became as heroic as the battle that preceded it. The fleet was not only a war machine but a brotherhood, reaching into the sea to save its own. By midnight, the scale of loss became evident. Dozens of planes lay at the bottom of the sea, ditched when fuel ran dry or destroyed in crash landings. Many pilots never returned, their names later etched into the long roll of the fallen. Yet hundreds had made it back, guided by Mitchell's daring illumination of the fleet. The balance between victory and tragedy was razor thin, a reminder of the human cost behind even the most one-sided triumphs. The sailors of Task Force 58, exhausted and shaken, cleared decks of wreckage and prepared their ships for the next day. For the Japanese, the sinking of Hyo and the damage inflicted was another step toward collapse. For the Americans, the night recovery was both a miracle and a nightmare, proof of courage but also of fragility. War at sea was unforgiving, where even victory could exact a heavy toll. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had claimed more lives than bombs alone could explain. The Twilight Battle of June 20th, 1944, became a symbol of both triumph and sacrifice. On one hand, the Americans had destroyed yet another Japanese carrier and damaged several others, proving their overwhelming dominance. On the other, the perilous night recovery underscored the razor's edge on which carrier warfare balanced. Mitchell's decision to light the fleet saved countless aviators, but even so, many were lost to the sea. The glow of ships across the dark horizon became etched into memory as the image of salvation and defiance. Pilots remembered the terror of approaching black decks, the roar of engines in the void, and the relief of finally touching down. Sailors remembered the chaos of crashes, the smell of burning fuel, and the desperate rush to save comrades. The night did not diminish the victory, but gave it depth, reminding all who fought that triumph was never without cost. As dawn approached, the fleets braced for what came next. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was entering its final act. The morning of June 21st, 1944, revealed a Philippine Sea transformed into a graveyard of ships and men. For Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa, the reality of defeat was undeniable. His mobile fleet, once envisioned as the instrument of Japan's salvation, was now a battered shadow of itself. 3 carriers lay beneath the waves, Shokaku, Taiho, and Hile, each taking hundreds of sailors with them into eternity. The decks of surviving carriers like Shyako and Junio were nearly empty, stripped of the squadrons that once filled them with life. Destroyers and cruisers limped westward, their decks scarred and their crews weary, as the fleet withdrew toward Okinawa and Japan's inner waters. Fuel was scarce, morale was shattered, and the once proud spirit of the Japanese Navy lay broken. Reports to Tokyo softened the disaster, exaggerating damage inflicted on the Americans, but the truth was plain at sea. Ozawa had lost the heart of his carrier force in just 2 days of battle. The retreat was not strategic, but desperate. The Empire's naval air arm had been gutted. On the American side, Task Force 58 steamed in relative strength, but the night had left scars of its own. Dozens of planes had been lost to darkness, fuel exhaustion, and crash landings, their wrecks now lying on the seabed or drifting as charred debris. Sailors on deck moved through the morning with red-rimmed eyes, exhausted from a night of firefighting, rescues, and ceaseless recovery operations. Destroyers still cruised the waters, searching for downed pilots and pulling survivors from the waves. Some aviators were found alive, clinging to rafts or floating wreckage, while others were lost forever to the vastness of the sea. For every pilot brought aboard, cheers erupted, small victories against the ocean itself. Yet sorrow accompanied triumph, for many names would never again be answered at roll call. Mitchell's gamble had won a battle, but demanded a toll in lives. The fleet mourned its fallen even as it celebrated its supremacy. In the aftermath of war, joy and grief were inseparable. The flight decks of American carriers told their own story of survival and sacrifice. Charred wreckage had been shoved overboard, but scorch marks, bent barriers, and twisted fragments still bore witness to the night's chaos. Pilots who had landed safely the night before walked with the weary shuffle of men who had seen death too closely. They spoke in hushed tones of circling in the darkness, of watching friends crash into the sea, of praying to see the faint glow of the fleet's lights. Ground crews, though equally exhausted, kept working, servicing the surviving aircraft in case another strike was needed. On the mess decks, conversations drifted between laughter and tears, stories of miraculous landings mixing with silence for those who did not return. For sailors and airmen alike, the Philippine Sea had become not only a battle, but a crucible of endurance. They had faced the enemy and prevailed, but the true test was surviving the sea itself. The morning light revealed the cost of victory. The fleet pressed on, carrying both triumph and tragedy. For the Japanese sailors aboard surviving carriers, the retreat was filled with despair. On Zuikaku, the once proud flagship of the Pearl Harbor strike force, hangar decks echoed with emptiness, the whine of machinery replacing the roar of squadrons that no longer existed. The survivors of downed squadrons sat in silence, their eyes hollow, knowing their comrades would never return. Some wept openly, while others stared into the horizon, consumed by the knowledge that Japan's naval power had been gutted beyond repair. The officers issued stoic commands, ordering ships to maintain speed and formation, but even they understood the truth. No number of new planes could replace the experienced aviators lost in the Philippine Sea. The mobile fleet, stripped of its air groups, was little more than a collection of floating targets. Retreat was not a tactic, but a necessity. The Philippine Sea had broken the backbone of Japan's naval aviation. The Empire's dream of a decisive victory was gone, and the American flagship, Admiral Spruance, received reports that confirmed the scale of the triumph. Intelligence estimated that more than 350 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on June 19th alone, with hundreds more lost in subsequent strikes and accidents. Submarine successes had claimed Shokaku and Taiho, while Mitchell's mission Beyond Darkness had added Haiho to the tally. The Japanese had lost nearly all their trained carrier pilots, a loss even more devastating than the ships themselves. Spruance, calm and reserved as always, accepted the reports with quiet satisfaction. He had preserved the invasion force at Saipan, destroyed the enemy's striking power, and secured the Marianas. For Mitchell and his aviators, the battle validated years of training and technological superiority. Yet both admirals knew the fight was not over. Japan still had ships, still had soldiers, still had the will to resist. The Philippine Sea was decisive, but it was not the end. The war pressed on, relentless and unforgiving. The sea itself bore grim testimony to the scale of destruction. Oil slicks stretched for miles, shimmering in the sunlight, mingling with debris and fragments of wreckage. Bodies floated among the waves, Japanese and American alike, reminders of the human cost of naval warfare. Rescue destroyers maneuvered carefully, nets and grappling hooks pulling survivors from the water. Some men, dazed and barely conscious, were lifted aboard to cheers and relief. Others were found too late, their faces pale beneath the unforgiving sun. For the Japanese survivors, the sea was both captor and grave, offering no salvation as their fleet retreated without them. For the Americans, each recovery was a small miracle, proof of comradeship and the value of every life. The Philippine Sea was vast, but it could not conceal the evidence of catastrophe. Victory at sea was always painted in oil, fire, and blood. The aftermath was as haunting as the battle itself. As the battered fleets withdrew from one another, reflections began to form among commanders and crews. For the Americans, the battle was proof that their doctrine of training, technology, and mass production had achieved complete superiority over Japan. For the Japanese, it was the bitter confirmation that courage and tradition alone could not win a modern war. The carrier arm, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been shattered beyond repair. Many officers understood that they would never again mount a serious carrier offensive. The future battles would be fought with dwindling resources, kamikaze desperation, and the hope of inflicting enough losses to stall America's advance. The Philippine Sea marked the end of Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare on equal terms. For the sailors who fought it, the lesson was burned into memory. The aftershocks of the battle rippled far beyond the horizon, into strategy, morale, and the fate of empires. By the time the sun set on June 21st, the Philippine Sea had fallen silent once more. The Japanese fleet retreated westward, its decks barren, its spirit broken, its strength gone. The American fleet remained unbroken, its crews weary but resolute, their carriers still bristling with aircraft, their decks ready for the next fight. The Marines on Saipan, locked in brutal combat on the beaches and hills, knew that their skies were safe, their flanks secure. The outcome of the battle was more than a tactical victory. It was the decisive elimination of Japan's naval air arm, a blow from which the empire would never recover. Yet the cost was remembered not only in ships sunk, but in the faces of aviators lost to the night sea. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was won, but victory bore scars of its own. The aftermath at sea was one of triumph, shadowed by tragedy, a reminder that even in victory, war left its indelible mark. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a clash of ships and planes. It was the definitive turning point in the balance of naval air power in the Pacific. With the loss of Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo, the Japanese Navy was stripped of three major fleet carriers, vessels that could never be replaced in either time or resources. Even more devastating was the destruction of nearly 600 aircraft, and with them, the last cadre of trained carrier aviators that Japan could field. These men were not just pilots, they were the product of years of experience, training, and combat knowledge that had been nurtured since the 1930s. When they vanished into the skies and seas of the Philippine Sea, their expertise was lost forever, leaving Japan with planes, but no pilot skilled enough to fly them effectively. The Imperial Navy, once dominant, could now only field carriers as hollow symbols, their decks empty and their hangars silent. The era of Japanese carrier supremacy, which began at Pearl Harbor, ended in the waters of the Philippine Sea. For the United States, the consequences were profound. They had achieved permanent control of the skies. The Pacific War's trajectory shifted irreversibly in their favor. The destruction of Japan's naval air arm cannot be overstated in its significance. In earlier battles, such as Coral Sea or Midway, Japan had lost ships, but retained many of its best pilots, preserving a measure of skill and cohesion. But by June 1944, the pilot pipeline had been exhausted. The men who flew against Task Force 58 were often poorly trained replacements, rushed through abbreviated programs that left them unprepared for the complexities of carrier operations and long-range strike missions. When they were slaughtered in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost not only numbers, but its last reserves of competence. There was no time, fuel, or resources to rebuild another generation of skilled aviators. Aircraft could be built in factories, but aviators could not be manufactured overnight. The consequence was simple but catastrophic. Japan's carriers were reduced to little more than decoys, unable to project meaningful power. In the months that followed, This deficiency became painfully clear. At Leyte Gulf, only months later, Japan's carriers would serve as bait, stripped of offensive strength. The Philippine Sea ensured that their true role as warships had ended. For the Americans, the battle validated a doctrine that emphasized not only technology, but also training and industrial depth. Navy had invested heavily in radar-directed interception, fighter control, and systematic pilot training, advantages that bore fruit in the skies of the Philippine Sea. American aviators were not only better equipped with Hellcats, but also better trained, their flight hours and tactical schooling far exceeding that of their Japanese counterparts. This systematic approach ensured that even as the war consumed men and machines, replacements arrived with competence and confidence. The Japanese could no longer match this cycle, trapped in a downward spiral of loss and desperation. Strategically, this imbalance meant that every future confrontation would be even more lopsided. US carriers could project air power with confidence, knowing that Japanese counterstrikes would lack the precision and force once feared. In essence, the battle institutionalized American dominance. The Philippine Sea was not merely a victory, it was the proof that the US war machine had reached full maturity. Japan could no longer compete on equal terms. The psychological impact of the battle was equally decisive. Within Japan, official communiques claimed success, boasting of American carriers sunk and battleships damaged, a fiction designed to preserve morale. But within naval circles, the truth was understood. The carrier arm was gone, its heart ripped out in a single campaign. Officers who had once believed in the dream of a decisive battle now faced the bitter reality that such a battle was no longer possible. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already shaken by Midway and the Solomons, was now shattered entirely. Morale among sailors and pilots plummeted, for they understood that courage alone could not overcome radar, training, and numbers. On the American side, the triumph reinforced confidence that victory was inevitable, fueling the belief that the war's end was only a matter of time. The battle became a symbol of industrial might overpowering tradition. It was proof that the age of elite warrior dominance had passed, replaced by mass production and systemic efficiency. The psychological gulf between the two navies widened as much as the physical one. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the fleets themselves, directly influencing the ground war in the Marianas. With Japanese air power shattered, the Marines fighting on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian no longer had to fear sustained aerial counterattacks. Their skies belonged entirely to the United States, and this dominance allowed for uninterrupted resupply, bombardment, and close air support. The battle ensured that the Marianas would fall into American hands, despite the ferocious resistance of Japanese defenders. And with the Marianas secured, a new phase of the war began, the establishment of airbases from which B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese home islands directly. This geographical consequence was enormous, bringing Tokyo, Osaka, and other industrial centers within range of strategic bombing. The road from the Philippine Sea led not just to tactical victory, but to the firebombing of Japanese cities, and ultimately, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thus, the destruction of Japan's naval air arm reverberated not only at sea, but across the very heart of the empire. The Philippine Sea opened the doorway to Japan's final defeat. The loss of trained pilots had ripple effects that crippled Japan's defense beyond the carrier fleet. The Army and Navy air forces, already stretched thin, now faced the impossible task of defending the homeland without the skilled cadres needed to train replacements. Young recruits were pushed into cockpits with minimal hours, their survival measured in days rather than months. The kamikaze strategy, which emerged later in 1944, was in part a direct response to this crisis. Lacking the ability to train competent aviators, Japan turned instead to suicide attacks, trading human lives for the hope of inflicting damage. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was thus the quiet prelude to the desperate suicidal tactics that defined Japan's last stand. The shift from seasoned, disciplined carrier pilots to kamikaze volunteers underscored the depth of the collapse. In this way, the Philippine Sea was not just the end of Japan's carrier era, but the beginning of its final desperate phase of warfare. It forced the empire into strategies born of hopelessness. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the victory was analyzed with sober satisfaction. Intelligence officers compiled reports showing the scale of Japanese losses, and strategists immediately saw the opportunity it presented. With the enemy's carrier air arm destroyed, the US could press forward with invasions deeper into the Pacific, with reduced risk. The Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa now lay within reach, each operation made possible by the elimination of Japanese carrier threat. For Roosevelt's administration, the victory provided political momentum, proof to the American public that the war in the Pacific was advancing decisively. In military circles, the Philippine Sea was recognized as the largest carrier battle in history, a triumph of doctrine and industry. Yet it also brought home the realization that the Japanese would fight on despite hopeless odds, prolonging the conflict and demanding further sacrifice. The strategic path was clear, but it was not yet easy. The Philippine Sea was a doorway, but not the end of the road. It was a milestone on the march to Tokyo. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as the moment when Japanese carrier power ceased to exist in any meaningful form. It was not just a battle won, but a capability erased, leaving the Imperial Navy hollow and incapable of recovery. The destruction of pilots, planes, and carriers created a vacuum that could never be filled, no matter how many ships Japan still possessed. The consequences were immediate: secure skies over the Marianas, and long-lasting, paving the way for strategic bombing and the final invasions of the war. For historians, the battle is remembered as the decisive end of one era and the beginning of another. The Pacific was no longer contested. It belonged to the United States. Yet within that victory lay the sobering reminder of what had been lost on both sides: lives, ships, and the fragile dreams of nations. The strategic consequences of the Philippine Sea echoed not only in the waters where it was fought, but in the cities, islands, and homelands it reshaped. It was a battle that changed the future, written in steel, fire, and sacrifice. For all the grandeur of fleets and the scale of destruction, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was ultimately a story of human beings. Young men who lived, fought, and often died in the vastness of the Pacific. On the American side, aviators who launched into the skies on June 20th carried with them not only bombs and torpedoes, but also photographs of loved ones tucked in flight jackets, letters in pockets, and hopes of returning home. When they struck Ozawa's fleet and turned eastward into darkness, they faced not the enemy but the merciless elements of sea and night. Pilots recalled the eerie silence of the flight back, compasses trembling, fuel needles sinking, and the horizon swallowed by blackness. Some prayed aloud in cockpits, voices cracking as they clung to faith. Others sang to themselves, fighting exhaustion with the rhythm of familiar tunes. A few resigned themselves to fate, whispering farewells before the sea claimed them. For those who survived, the experience etched scars that never faded. The battle was not just victory, it was survival fought minute by minute. Among the American aviators, stories of both loss and salvation abounded. Lieutenant General David McCampbell, later to become America's top Navy ace, described how night recoveries tested even the most skilled pilots, with many of his comrades crashing short of the decks or slamming into barriers. One aviator, running out of fuel, ditched within sight of his carrier, only to watch helplessly as the ship steamed past, unable to halt amid the chaos. Destroyer crews worked furiously to save such men, leaping into small boats or tossing lifelines as engines roared. Some were pulled aboard, shivering and dazed, eyes wide with disbelief at their survival. Others disappeared beneath the waves, gone in seconds, their last cries drowned by the sea. For every rescue there was another tragedy, and sailors remembered both with equal clarity. The heroism of those who risked their lives in rescue operations was as great as those who flew into battle. The ocean was not merciful, but comradeship was unbreakable. In war, humanity endured even in the darkest night. For the Japanese, the human cost was even more profound, for their losses were not only in ships, but in the very lifeblood of their naval air arm. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, had climbed into cockpits on June 19th with dreams of glory and sacrifice for the Emperor. Most never returned. Survivors from the Turkey Shoot described watching comrades erupt into flames mid-air, wings torn apart by tracer fire, or engines trailing smoke as planes plunged helplessly into the sea. Sailors aboard Japanese carriers wept as they watched the skies empty, their comrades vanishing one by one into the vast Pacific. On ships like Zuikaku, hangar decks once filled with bustling mechanics and confident aviators became silent caverns of absence. Families back home would be told their sons had died heroically, but in truth, most perished without striking a single blow. The loss was not only physical, but spiritual, the shattering of a warrior tradition. The human cost for Japan was a generation of airmen sacrificed in a single futile gamble. The fate of Japanese sailors was equally harrowing. When Shokaku and Taiho exploded, hundreds of men were trapped below decks, suffocated by fire or swallowed by the sea as compartments flooded. Survivors who leapt overboard faced burning oil slicks, the water aflame around them, forcing them to swim through hell to find open sea. Others clung to debris for hours, only to be abandoned as the fleet retreated, leaving them adrift in an unforgiving ocean. Some were rescued days later by American submarines or destroyers, taken prisoner and given water and food they had not tasted in days. For many, capture was both humiliation and salvation, a bitter end to loyalty and sacrifice. For those not rescued, the Philippine Sea became their grave, their names lost to the waves. Japanese sailors knew that their empire could not replace them, that their deaths were part of a larger unraveling. Their personal stories, untold in official communiques, reflected the tragedy of loyalty meeting futility. The sea, impartial and immense, swallowed them all. The American sailors who watched the night recovery unfold spoke of it as the most haunting experience of their service. They described decks illuminated like cities, pilots lining up in endless streams, and the sickening crashes as aircraft missed hooks and skidded across steel. Some sailors carried the injured from flaming cockpits, faces blackened with smoke and eyes wide with terror. Others pushed wreckage overboard, clearing space for the next desperate landing, even as the screams of trapped men lingered in their ears. Every successful touchdown was met with relief, every crash with anguish. By morning, many sailors sat in stunned silence, aware that their fleet had won, but that their comrades had been lost not to enemy fire, but to the night itself. The sea had claimed as many as combat did. For them the victory felt incomplete, its glory tempered by grief. They remembered not the statistics but the faces of friends who never came back. The human cost of war was written in those absences. The Japanese survivors who returned to their carriers carried with them trauma that words could barely capture. Aviators who had fought their way back spoke of watching entire squadrons annihilated, of flying alone through hostile skies, and of landing on decks that no longer had comrades waiting. Many were guilt-ridden, haunted by the memory of friends consumed in flames or lost to the sea. Sailors recalled the eerie silence of hangars that once thundered with life, now filled with the smell of smoke and loss. The absence of aircraft and comrades was more powerful than any explosion. In their eyes, the battle had not just destroyed planes but broken a brotherhood. Officers tried to inspire them with rhetoric of sacrifice, but the young men knew the truth. Their lives had been spent cheaply, thrown into hopeless odds. For them, the Philippine Sea was not only defeat, but betrayal. The human cost was measured in sorrow as much as in blood. In both navies, the aftermath left scars that extended far beyond the battle. American pilots returned home with stories of survival, their families celebrating their return, but often unaware of the nightmares that lingered. Some never flew again, their nerves shattered by the terror of night recoveries. Japanese families received notices of death, couched in honor, but the reality was mass slaughter, their sons reduced to statistics in an unwinnable war. Survivors on both sides carried guilt, loss, and trauma that would remain long after the war ended. Letters home attempted to soften the truth, hiding the horror behind words of duty and honor. Yet in private the memories were sharp, the smell of burning fuel, the cries of comrades, the endless sea swallowing the fallen. The human cost was not erased by victory or defeat. It was borne in silence, in memory, and in grief. War's true toll was always measured in lives, not ships. Thus, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, remembered as a triumph of strategy and technology, was also a crucible of human suffering. For the Americans, it was a victory shadowed by the loss of aviators who perished not in combat but in their struggle to return home. For the Japanese, it was a catastrophe that consumed a generation of pilots and sailors, extinguishing traditions built over decades in 2 terrible days. The statistics told one story: carriers sunk, aircraft destroyed, but the faces told another: young men who dreamed, fought, and died far from home. The ocean that divided empires became their grave, indifferent to allegiance or cause. The human cost of the Philippine Sea gave depth to its legacy, a reminder that beneath the banners of triumph lay tragedy. For every victory, there was a price paid in silence and sorrow. The battle was not just history, it was memory carved in lives, and those lives, lost or scarred, were the true measure of the sea's toll. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was inseparable from the bitter struggle for Saipan, the heart of the Marianas campaign. Even as American aviators fought in the skies, Marines and soldiers were locked in ferocious combat on the island's beaches and volcanic ridges. The naval victory ensured that Japanese reinforcements could never reach Saipan, isolating its defenders and dooming them to fight alone. For the Americans, control of the seas meant uninterrupted resupply, close air support, and the steady build-up of strength ashore. Japanese commanders on the island pleaded for relief, but their cries were drowned out by the silence of a shattered fleet. Every day the air grew darker with American planes overhead, their dominance uncontested after the destruction of Japan's carrier air arm. Saipan became both a battlefield and a symbol, its capture signaling the collapse of Japan's outer defensive ring. The island's defense was a matter of national honor for Tokyo, yet honor could not overcome the reality of overwhelming force. The Battle of the Philippine Sea sealed Saipan's fate before the last ridge was taken. Victory at sea and victory on land became two halves of the same triumph. The conquest of Saipan was brutal, marked by ferocious Japanese resistance and devastating American firepower. Marines stormed ashore on June 15, 1944, under a hail of artillery and machine gun fire, carving a bloody foothold on the beaches. Inland, they encountered caves, tunnels, and fortified positions that turned every hill into a fortress. Tanks clashed with infantry, flamethrowers cleared bunkers, and artillery pounded defensive lines with relentless force. The Japanese fought with tenacity, launching suicidal counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans. Yet without air or naval support, these efforts were doomed to failure. Each day, the American grip tightened, and the defenders were forced back into the island's mountainous core. By early July, resistance coalesced into desperate last stands, culminating in one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese soldiers hurled themselves into a hopeless assault, and thousands died in the attempt. Saipan became a graveyard for the Japanese army as well as the navy. For civilians on Saipan, the battle was a tragedy of immense proportions. The island's population, many of them Japanese settlers and indigenous Chamorro people, were caught in the crossfire of modern warfare. Japanese authorities had long instilled the belief that capture by Americans meant torture and death, and as defeat loomed, thousands of civilians chose suicide over surrender. Entire families leapt from cliffs into the sea, mothers clutching children as they fell, driven by terror and indoctrination. Marines who witnessed the scenes were horrified, trying in vain to persuade civilians that surrender meant life, not death. The cliffs of Saipan became silent monuments to despair, reminders that propaganda could be as deadly as any weapon. For survivors, the occupation brought both relief and grief, the trauma of loss mingling with the shock of survival. Saipan's conquest was thus not only a military triumph, but also a humanitarian catastrophe. The echoes of those suicides haunted both victors and vanquished. The human cost of the Marianas campaign reached beyond soldiers to civilians swept up in its storm. The fall of Saipan reverberated in Tokyo with a force greater than any bomb. For the first time, the Japanese homeland lay within range of American strategic bombers. From the airfields of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, the newly deployed B-29 superfortresses could strike the industrial heart of Japan with unprecedented reach. Factories, ports, and cities that had seemed distant and untouchable were now within the radius of destruction. The psychological effect was devastating, for it meant the war could no longer be kept at a distance. Every Japanese citizen now lived under the shadow of aerial bombardment. The fall of Saipan was not merely a military setback, it was the collapse of a defensive strategy that had promised to shield the homeland. Leaders in Tokyo recognized that the Marianas campaign had torn down the final barrier. The empire was exposed, vulnerable in a way it had never been before. The link between Saipan and Japan's ultimate defeat was now inescapable. The political consequences were immediate and seismic. News of Saipan's fall reached Tokyo in mid-July, and it sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had guided Japan through much of the war, found his leadership fatally undermined. His promises of victory, his reassurances of strength, and his control over the military were shattered by the undeniable disaster. Public confidence collapsed, and even his allies in the cabinet could no longer defend his position. On July 18, 1944, Tojo resigned, bringing down his government in a moment of political reckoning. The fall of Saipan had toppled not only defenses, but the very leadership of wartime Japan. The link between the battlefield and the halls of power was stark and undeniable. The conquest of a single island had shaken an empire to its core. For Japan, Saipan was not just lost ground, it was the unraveling of authority. For the Americans, the capture of Saipan was a triumph that reshaped the strategic map of the Pacific. It gave the US Navy and Army Air Forces a forward base of operations from which to launch the next great offensives. The Marianas became the springboard for the liberation of the Philippines, the assault on Iwo Jima, and ultimately the bombing of Japan itself. Engineers worked with astonishing speed, transforming the captured island into a fortress of runways, supply depots, and naval anchorages. The massive B-29 airfields soon dotted the landscape, their concrete strips stretching across what had once been battlefields. Saipan became a symbol of American power projection, proof that logistics and industry could conquer any distance. From its shores, the final phase of the Pacific War was launched. The island was not merely a prize of war, but the key to victory. Its capture turned the tide not just locally, but globally. The consequences radiated far beyond its shores. Japanese commanders understood all too well the broader implications of Saipan's loss. Admiral Toyoda and the remaining naval staff recognized that their carrier fleet, already crippled by the Philippine Sea, could no longer protect the empire's outer ring. General Anami and the army leaders conceded that the Marianas had been the linchpin of defense, and without it, the path to Japan was open. In their desperation, they began planning for new strategies of attrition, including the eventual adoption of kamikaze tactics. Yet such strategies revealed the depth of their defeat. They no longer hoped for victory, only for delay. The loss of Saipan marked the point at which Japanese strategy turned from offense to despair. No longer could they shape events, they could only react. The collapse of Tojo's government symbolized this shift, the fall of a leader who embodied aggressive expansion. The wider war now moved inexorably toward Japan itself. Saipan was the domino that toppled the empire's illusion of security. The link between the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the fall of Saipan was undeniable, each amplifying the impact of the other. At sea, the destruction of Japan's naval air arm ensured that Saipan would fall on land. The fall of Saipan ensured that Japan itself was now exposed. Together, they represented a twin catastrophe for Tokyo, military, political, and psychological. The consequences rippled outward. The collapse of Tojo's government, the opening of airfields for strategic bombing, and the steady march of American forces closer to the home islands. For the Americans, it was a vindication of strategy and sacrifice, proof that their momentum could not be stopped. For the Japanese, it was the moment when hope gave way to desperation, when the dream of victory became the grim reality of survival. The Marianas became the pivot point of the Pacific War. Saipan was not just an island, it was the gateway to Japan's downfall, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea had opened that gate wide. The Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of the most decisive naval engagements in history, not simply for the ships sunk or aircraft destroyed, but for what it represented: the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. The waters that had once echoed with the dominance of the Imperial Navy were left silent, stripped of the squadrons that had carried Japan to early victories. Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway had been chapters in a story of daring carrier warfare, but the Philippine Sea closed that book forever. From this point onward, Japan could no longer contest the skies with trained aviators, and its carriers became hollow symbols of past power. The loss of 3 carriers and nearly 600 aircraft in just 2 days was catastrophic, but even more devastating was the loss of experienced pilots who could never be replaced. The Imperial Navy had gambled everything and lost. For the Americans, the battle validated years of doctrine, training, and industrial might, proving that preparation and technology could triumph over tradition. The sea itself bore silent witness to the transformation of naval warfare. The Philippine Sea was not merely a victory, it was a watershed in history. In naval terms, the battle confirmed the dominance of the aircraft carrier as the supreme instrument of maritime power. Battleships, once the kings of the sea, played only a supporting role, their guns largely silent while the skies decided the outcome. The clash was fought and won by carriers, fighters, and bombers, guided by radar and coordinated by advanced communication systems. This was the new face of war at sea: long-range strikes, electronic detection, and air superiority as the decisive factor. For naval historians, the Philippine Sea crystallized lessons that would define the modern era, that victory belonged not to those with the largest ships, but to those with the best trained pilots, the most advanced technology, and the industrial capacity to sustain them. The Japanese had none of these advantages by 1944. Their reliance on courage and tradition, without resources to match, became their undoing. The Americans, by contrast, had perfected the art of carrier warfare, marrying doctrine with overwhelming production. The Philippine Sea proved that the future of naval combat was in the air. It was a revelation written in fire and steel. Yet beyond technology and doctrine, the battle was also a testament to human endurance and courage. American aviators who launched the mission Beyond Darkness knew that they were flying into danger that might not end with victory, but with death in the sea. Japanese pilots, though poorly trained and outmatched, still flew into combat with determination, often knowing they faced overwhelming odds. Sailors on both sides fought not only the enemy but the vastness of the Pacific itself, the heat, the exhaustion, the darkness, and the endless waves. Courage was not measured by victory alone, but by the willingness to face fear and uncertainty in the heart of battle. The night recoveries, the desperate rescues, and the last stands of Japanese defenders all spoke to the human spirit that endured amid catastrophe. In the end, courage could not alter the outcome, but it gave dignity to those who fought and fell. The Philippine Sea was as much about men as it was about machines. It remains a reminder that technology may shape battles, but humanity endures within them. For the Japanese, the legacy of the battle was bitter and enduring. It marked the moment when their naval strategy collapsed, when the dream of a decisive victory vanished, and when the empire's vulnerability was laid bare. The loss of Saipan, enabled by the battle, brought the war to Japan's doorstep and toppled Tojo's government. The Philippine Sea thus became both a military and political catastrophe, its consequences reverberating far beyond the waves. In the months that followed, Japan turned to desperation, adopting kamikaze tactics and relying on increasingly hopeless strategies of attrition. The loss of trained aviators in June 1944 ensured that such measures were the only path left. For the Japanese people, the battle was remembered less in detail than in its effects: the bombings, the invasions, and the eventual surrender it set in motion. The Imperial Navy, once a symbol of pride, was reduced to impotence. The Philippine Sea was the grave of its power. The echoes of that defeat lingered long after the war's end. For the Americans, the legacy was one of vindication and confidence. The battle demonstrated that their investment in radar, pilot training, and mass production had yielded overwhelming results. It validated the sacrifices of the years since Pearl Harbor and assured the nation that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. The U.S. Navy emerged from the Philippine Sea stronger than ever, its carriers and crews seasoned by success and ready for the final push toward Japan. At home, the victory bolstered morale, proving to the American public that the tide of war had turned irreversibly. For the men who fought, it was a source of pride tempered by grief, for they knew the cost had been high even in triumph. Mitch's decision to light the fleet, Spruance's cautious strategy, and the aviator's endurance all became part of the lore of the US Navy. The battle entered the annals of history, not only as a strategic triumph, but as a human drama. Its lessons would be studied for generations, shaping the future of naval warfare. The Philippine Sea was America's proof of mastery in the Pacific. The battle's place in history is unique, for it was not defined by dramatic duels of battleships or the sudden reversal of fortune seen at Midway. Instead, it was defined by the steady, systematic destruction of an enemy's ability to fight. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot symbolized this asymmetry. Hundreds of Japanese planes cut from the skies with minimal American losses. It was not a battle of equals, but a battle of inevitability, where preparation and superiority overwhelmed courage and desperation. This very nature makes it a profound lesson in the evolution of war. Wars are not won by single moments of brilliance alone, but by years of preparation, logistics, and training that make victory possible. The Philippine Sea showed that decisive battles in the modern era were as much the product of factories and classrooms as they were of fleets and admirals. It was not a duel of chance, but a clash of systems, and in that clash, Japan could not compete. The outcome was foreordained by imbalance. In memorials, books, and the memories of veterans, the Philippine Sea remains a battle both celebrated and mourned. For survivors, it was a story of triumph, shadowed by loss. Comrades who never returned, planes that never touched down, and ships that vanished beneath the waves. For historians, it is a turning point, marking the effective end of Japan's capacity to wage naval war. For sailors and aviators, it is remembered in the details, the glow of ships lit in defiance, the roar of planes landing in darkness, the silent wreckage scattered across the ocean. The sea itself holds the graves of thousands, American and Japanese alike, resting in silence beneath the waves they once fought upon. Their sacrifice gives weight to the statistics, reminding us that history is written in lives as much as in numbers. The legacy of the Philippine Sea is therefore both victory and remembrance. It is both triumph and tragedy. It endures in memory, as much a human story as a strategic one. Ultimately, the legacy of the Battle of the Philippine Sea lies in the lessons it offers for all time. It demonstrates that wars are not won by courage alone, but by preparation, innovation, and the ability to adapt. It shows that leadership, whether Spruance's caution or Mitch's daring, can determine not only victory but survival. It underscores the importance of training, technology, and the will to endure when the night is darkest. And above all, it reminds us that behind every triumph are human beings, whose sacrifices give meaning to history. For Japan, the battle marked the end of a dream. For America, it marked the assurance of victory. For the world, it became a case study in the evolution of naval warfare, where the carrier replaced the battleship and industry replaced tradition. The Philippine Sea was more than a battle, it was a hinge of history. Its legacy lives not only in the past, but in the enduring lessons it offers, and those lessons remain as relevant today as they were in 1944.